He had waited 15 years for this moment. 15 years of survival, reconstruction, honing himself into a weapon whose name was not recorded in any file. And now, Kieran Vale stood before the church gates in a torrential downpour, dressed in a pitch-black suit, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes as cold as ice pulled from the ocean floor. Today was his wedding day. Today was also the day destruction began. His bride was the daughter of the man who had burned him alive in a warehouse 15 years ago and stolen everything. Lucian Drax was about to realize the biggest mistake of his life, of letting Kieran Vale live. If you want to know how this marriage ends, comment the city you're viewing from, so I know how far my story has progressed. Don't miss a second. The rain had been falling since before dawn. It came in sheets off the harbor, the kind of cold, filthy rain that smelled like motor oil and brine and something older beneath that, like the city itself was bleeding through its pores. Blackwater's skyline dissolved in the gray murk above, towers of glass and concrete going vague and ghost-like, and in the streets below the water ran in brown rivers along the gutters, carrying cigarette ends and lottery tickets, and the occasional crumpled business card of someone who no longer needed one. The matte black Rolls-Royce pulled to the curb in front of St. Aurelius Cathedral at precisely 11:47 in the morning, and the door opened before the driver had even fully stopped. Kieran Vale stepped out into the downpour without an umbrella. He stood there for a moment on the wet stone, just stood there, not moving, rain drumming across his shoulders and running in thin rivulets down the hard line of his jaw. He was 41 years old and looked it in ways that photographs never quite captured. The jaw was clean-shaved but brutally angled, the cheekbones too sharp, the skin beneath his eyes carrying that particular bruised shadow that belongs to men who have spent years sleeping in places where sleeping wasn't really safe. His suit was black. His shirt was black. The only contrast was a slim silk tie the color of wet ash, and the pale, deliberate calm of his eyes, gray, almost colorless in the rain, set deep beneath heavy brows that were doing nothing, giving nothing away. His hands were at his sides. The left one had two fingers that didn't fully straighten anymore, the bones having been broken and reset incorrectly somewhere along the years, and there was a thin lateral scar running from the heel of his palm up past the wrist, stopping just short of the inner forearm. If you knew what caused scars like that, you would have recognized it as the mark of a wire binding pulled free by brute force. If you didn't know, you would simply have looked away, because the look on Kieran Vale's face during the 8 seconds he stood in the rain outside that cathedral was not the kind of face that invited curiosity. His driver, a broad-chested man named Toll, came around with an umbrella and held it uselessly over him. "Sir, leave it!" Toll withdrew. Kieran took a breath, exhaled slowly. The steam came off him in thin curls that the rain immediately erased. Inside the cathedral, 300 people were waiting. Senators, crime family proxies wearing respectable suits, federal judges who had stopped being federal in any meaningful sense about 10 years into their careers. The entire upper architecture of Blackwater's underworld, assembled beneath flying buttresses and stained glass, dressed in their finest and pretending they were somewhere other than a political transaction dressed up in silk and flowers. At the altar, in ivory, Serafina Drax. Kieran had seen her once before today. A photograph, printed on matte paper, slid across a mahogany table by a man named Orsini, who was running courier work between two families. The photograph showed a woman in her late 20s, pale and composed, standing in a garden that Kieran had later identified as the grounds of the Drax estate in the northern hills. She was not smiling in the photograph. She was not anything in the photograph. Her face had the absolute absence of expression that Kieran recognized from mirrors and understood immediately. Not serenity, not coldness, but the specific hollowness that lives in people who learned early that expressions have consequences. He had looked at that photograph for approximately 4 seconds, and then put it face down on the table. He was not marrying her because she was beautiful. He was not marrying her because the alliance made strategic sense, though the alliance did make strategic sense, and he had needed the cover it provided, the reach into the Drax infrastructure, the quiet access to Lucian's books and lieutenants, and the inherited trust that came from being the old man's son-in-law. He was marrying her because she was Lucian Drax's daughter, because Lucian Drax had stood in a warehouse on the East Docks 15 years ago and given a nod, just a nod, barely even that, a small downward motion of a heavy gray head, and then walked out while two of his men poured accelerant across the floor, and Kieran had been left in a burning room with a wire around his wrists and the full conviction that this was how his life was ending. He had been 26. He had believed until that moment that loyalty meant something to Lucien, that the 15 months he had spent running guns and laundering movement funds and putting 3 of Lucien's competitors underground had established something between them. Not love, not even respect. Something like the mutual understanding between 2 men who had each seen the other operate and found the other useful. He had been wrong. What Lucien had seen was a young man who knew too much, an heir who might eventually rival him, a loose end in a beautiful suit. Kieran had burned through the wire by feeding it against a structural bolt while the smoke thickened around him. He had crawled out through a vent in the factory's lower wall with the hair on his left arm scorched off and his lungs tasting like char for the following 3 weeks. He had disappeared that night. Not run, disappeared, which was a different and far more deliberate thing. And for 15 years he had existed in the spaces between names, building something new in the dark from the bones of everything Lucien had taken. He had not planned on marriage. But 6 months ago, word had come through Orsini that Lucien was consolidating. Looking for a binding arrangement with the Vale name, what remained of it, what Kieran had quietly been reassembling without anyone noticing, to shore up his eastern operations against a new pressure from a third organization nobody had a clean read on yet. And Lucien had offered his daughter's hand like a business card. He didn't know who he was offering it to. He thought Kieran Vale was dead. He thought the name he was reaching out to was a nephew, a distant inheritor, some pale continuation of a bloodline he'd already disposed of. The irony of that had tasted to Kieran like the only meal worth eating in a very long time. He walked through the cathedral's main doors. The interior hit him the way interiors always hit him, too enclosed, the smell of old stone and candle wax, and the subtle chemical undertone of 300 people wearing expensive products in a room with insufficient ventilation. His shoulders did something involuntary, and he consciously reset them. Kept his face level, hands at his sides, eyes moving in the practiced, unobvious sweep he had learned to perform without looking like he was performing it. Exits, structural columns, the positions of the 8 Drax security men he could immediately identify by the cut of their lapels and the way they stood with their weight slightly wrong for men who were only here to witness a wedding. The music started. He walked to the altar. He did not look at the guests. He looked at her. Serafina Drax was standing very still in ivory silk and lace gloves that came to her elbows, and she was staring straight forward with an expression that reminded Kieran, with unexpected force, of a painting he had once seen in a black market Brussels gallery. A woman at a window, looking out at nothing, painted with the technical precision of someone trying to capture what it looked like when a person had gone somewhere inside themselves that had no return address. She did not look at him when he took his place beside her. Her hands were clasped in front of her. He could see through the lace that they were trembling slightly. Not nervousness. Something else. The trembling of chronic tension, the kind that lives in the muscles of people whose nervous systems have been rewired by prolonged exposure to threat. He filed that observation away. The officiant was speaking. Kieran tracked the words only peripherally, maintaining the outer performance of a man getting married while the actual machinery of his mind continued its work. Lucy Ann Drax, seated in the front row to the left, gray-haired and barrel-chested, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars, his face carrying the settled satisfaction of a man who believed he had just secured something. 3 of Lucien's senior men behind him. An empty seat beside Lucien where, according to Orsini's pre-event intelligence, a woman named Castellane was supposed to be sitting, but wasn't. Noted. The exits. The cameras on the exterior mounted below the stone cornices. The single Drax sniper Kieran's advance team had identified 2 days ago on a building across the street, there to ensure the ceremony concluded on terms Lucien controlled. Kieran's own men had already handled the sniper. Not violently. He was currently sedated in a maintenance closet 3 blocks away, his rifle disassembled, his radio switched to a loop of ambient background static. He would wake up with a headache and a story nobody would believe. The vows reached their obligatory moment. Kieran turned to face Serafina fully for the first time. She turned too, mechanically, her eyes lifting to his with the specific resignation of someone completing a transaction they've already mentally closed. Her irises were blue, a pale, watery blue, like winter sky at the edge of freezing, and there was, beneath the surface of them, something layered, something that had been through processes he could not yet name. He kept his voice low, below the register of anyone seated beyond the first row. "You know why I married you." It wasn't a question. Serafina didn't blink. "I have several theories," she said quietly. Her voice was flat and clear and completely devoid of the tremor her hands were still maintaining. It was the voice of a woman who had long since learned to manage the distance between what her body did and what her words communicated. "To punish your father." Her eyes moved, not away, not down, but through him. A brief reorientation, like a soldier adjusting to a new target bearing. Something crossed her face, not fear. He had expected fear. What he found instead was something that looked disturbingly like recognition, like she had already known, like she had walked into this cathedral holding a version of the same knowledge. The officiant was watching them with polite confusion at the pause. Kieran held her gaze. "You may..." And then it happened. A sound, distant but distinct, the heavy stutter drum of a helicopter rotor, sweeping in low from somewhere over the harbor. Probably nothing. Probably a Coast Guard transit or a news bird killing time above the Drax wedding circus. Serafina went rigid. It was instantaneous and total, every muscle in her body snapping to a locked position, her breath stopping mid-inhale, her pupils dilating in a single abrupt expansion that swept the blue nearly out of her irises. Her hands, clasped in front of her, tightened until the knuckles whitened through the lace. The trembling stopped because everything stopped, replaced by a vibrating stillness that was far more alarming than any amount of shaking. Kieran watched it happen from approximately 18 inches away. He did not move. He did not reach for her. He simply watched, filing everything. The specific pattern of physiological response, the speed of onset, the helicopter trigger, the fact that this was not general anxiety. This was a trained response to a specific stimulus. Her lips parted. "They found me again." Her voice was barely a thread of sound, nearly no volume at all, intended for no one. But he heard it. He stood very still inside his chest. The officiant, oblivious, leaned forward helpfully. "Do you take this man?" "Yes," Serafina said, in her flat, clear voice, her eyes still carrying that enormous, dilated terror, while her mouth performed the required social function completely on autopilot. "Yes," Kieran said. The ring, the pronouncement, the flash of 300 phone cameras going off simultaneously outside the cathedral's massive doors as they opened onto the stone steps, paparazzi jostling in the rain behind the velvet rope line, shouting names, lenses raised, lights strobing white in the gray afternoon. Kieran took Serafina's arm as they walked out. She walked precisely, did not stumble. Smiled once, a small, practiced, structurally perfect smile deployed for the cameras the way a person deploys a tool. And then the smile was gone, and she was back to nothing, her hand resting in the crook of his elbow with the careful weight of a woman who was touching someone she did not trust, but had decided, for the moment, to tolerate. They stood at the top of the cathedral steps in the rain. Cameras flashed. Someone called her name. Someone called his name. A man in a gray raincoat near the back of the press line was not holding a camera, and Kieran clocked him at an elapsed time of approximately 2 seconds and then let his eyes move past without pausing, because you never let them know you saw them. That was the first rule, the oldest rule. Lucy Yan Drax appeared at Kieran's elbow, beaming, a broad and genuine smile on his brutal face, the smile of a man who had just acquired something he wanted. He gripped Kieran's forearm and leaned in. "Welcome to the family, son." The word landed in Kieran's chest like a lit match. He smiled back. Clean, warm, entirely manufactured. "Thank you, Lucien, for everything." The old man patted his arm and moved on to work the crowd, and Kieran stood in the rain with Lucien Drax's daughter on his arm and felt the architecture of 15 years of careful, patient construction clicking into its final configuration around him. He had exactly what he needed. Now he needed to understand what he had actually acquired. The Vale penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a dark glass tower above the Meridian Financial District, and Serafina was shown to her rooms, a separate suite, as stipulated in the arrangement, privacy maintained, the fiction of the marriage to be performed only in public, by a woman named Harlow, who served as the penthouse's household manager and who had been with Kieran long enough to know that questions were not a feature of employment in this household. Serafina took in the rooms without visible reaction. They were large, clean. The windows looked out over the harbor, and in the rain and failing afternoon light, the harbor was a smear of gray and blue-black, the lights of distant tankers moving like slow stars across the water. The furniture was expensive and looked barely touched. There were no personal effects anywhere in the suite. No photographs, no books left out, no half-empty glasses suggesting someone had been here before her. The room had the specific quality of a place that had been prepared by people who had been told to make something livable and had interpreted the instruction at face value. She stood in the center of the bedroom for a moment. Then she turned and checked the window locks. Then the closet. Then the bathroom. Then back to the bedroom, pulling back the bed covers methodically, checking beneath the mattress, running her fingers along the bed frame, along the seams of the headboard, the edges of the nightstand. Harlow was still in the doorway. Serafina glanced at her. "You can leave," she said. Harlow left. Serafina continued her inspection. The air vents, the baseboards, the smoke detector, which she took down, examined, and replaced. The lamp bases, the outlet covers. She worked methodically and without visible embarrassment, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone performing a procedure they have performed in every new room they have entered for a very long time. When she was satisfied, she sat on the edge of the bed, still in the ivory gown, the lace gloves folded neatly in her lap. Her breathing regulated slowly. In the main penthouse, Kieran stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows with a glass of water he hadn't touched and looked out at the same harbor. Behind him, Toll was running through the day's security log in low tones, flagging the man in the gray raincoat, confirmed as an intelligence contractor, domestic, not Drax-affiliated, and 3 other anomalies from the ceremony perimeter. Kieran was barely listening. He was thinking about 4 words. They found me again. He expected manipulation. He'd fully prepared for it. The daughter deployed as a soft intelligence asset, feeding him warmth and access, and manufactured vulnerability while relaying everything back to Lucian. It was textbook. It was exactly what he would have done in Lucian's position, and he had arranged the architecture of the penthouse and the arrangement accordingly. Separate suites, separate security rotations, nothing of operational value accessible to anyone who hadn't earned clearance through channels entirely independent of the marriage. He expected manipulation, and what he found instead over the following 2 weeks was something that made the manipulation scenario seem almost restful by comparison. The first time he noticed the scars was 3 days in. He was passing through the main hallway when Serafina came out of her suite in a short-sleeved t-shirt. She hadn't heard him coming. He moved quietly, and she clearly hadn't expected anyone in that section of the penthouse at 7 in the morning, and he saw her arms before she processed that he was there. The sleeves came down in the same motion as her head coming up, but he'd seen. Burns scarring along both forearms, old and silver white, overlapping in the irregular pattern that comes from multiple separate incidents rather than a single event. And on the inside of her left wrist, visible for only a moment before the fabric covered it, something that wasn't a burn, something more deliberate, a pattern of marks with the specific regularity of something carved rather than something suffered accidentally. She met his eyes. Neither of them said anything. She walked past him toward the kitchen. He stood in the hallway for a moment with the back of his throat doing something tight and unpleasant, and then he went to his office and closed the door and sat at his desk and did not begin any of the work he'd intended to begin. The numbers came 3 nights later. He was awake at 2 in the morning. He was frequently awake at 2 in the morning. This was not new. Reviewing encrypted files from his procurement network when the sound came through the wall. Serafina's suite was adjacent to the office, separated by insulated drywall and a structural beam. He'd noted the adjacency when selecting the room arrangements and had factored it as potentially useful for passive monitoring. What came through the wall at 2 in the morning was not useful. It was a sound he had heard before in various field contexts and in certain types of places, and he associated it with a specific category of human experience that lived in the registers of absolute helplessness. It was screaming, not an intruder sound, not a cry for help, a nightmare sound, disoriented, thrashing, and underneath it, words. Fragments, syllables in at least 2 languages he could identify, one Spanish adjacent, one that sounded Eastern European, cycling through repetitions that had the quality of things that had been screamed before many times until they were worn into grooves. He stood outside her door for a moment with his hand not quite touching the frame. Then it stopped. Silence. He went back to his desk. In the morning, Serafina was at the kitchen table with black coffee and a newspaper and an expression of absolute ordinary composure, and neither of them mentioned the night. This continued for 11 days. On the 12th day, one of his security rotation, a former military man named Kress, solid and professional, 12 years on Kieran's payroll, was making a late-night sweep of the penthouse's secondary corridor when he turned a corner and found himself on the ground. He wasn't entirely certain how he'd gotten there. What he knew was that there was a blade against his carotid artery and a knee on his sternum, and the weight above him was slight but precisely distributed in a way that made moving impossible. And the face looking down at him in the dark was Serafina Drax, except that the face was not the face she wore during daylight hours. The eyes were open but not present. The expression was the specific blank operational mask of a person who was elsewhere. And she was holding the blade with the grip of someone who had been trained to hold blades, not the grip of someone who had once taken a self-defense class. Kress, to his very significant credit, did not move. "Ma'am," he said, very carefully and very clearly, "it's Kress. I work for Mr. Vale." Nothing. "Ma'am, Serafina." Her eyes shifted, refocused. The blade withdrew and she was up in the same motion, and for a moment she stood over him in the dark hallway looking down at Kress on the floor, and her face went through something terrible. Not guilt, which would have been comprehensible, but a kind of reckoning with something that lived below guilt, something foundational. She helped him up. "I apologize," she said. Her voice was completely steady. In the morning, she said nothing about it, and Kress filed his report in the blade, a custom, balanced, non-standard weapon, the kind produced by exactly 3 manufacturers in the world, none of them commercial, was noted and catalogued and placed in Kieran's growing file. He had not yet confronted her. He was watching. It was the file on his inside wrist that he broke on. He had a contact in the international intelligence trading community, a man named Pell, who operated out of Rotterdam and dealt exclusively in information that other information dealers had declined to handle. And Kieran had sent him the photographs of the marks, taken without Serafina's knowledge, during a moment when she'd fallen asleep on the penthouse sofa with her wrist exposed. Pell came back in 36 hours. "That's an asset designation system," Pell said over an encrypted line, his voice carrying the particular academic flatness of a man who had spent decades processing atrocity as data. "Modified from a methodology developed in classified intelligence programs, late 90s, not government, private sector. The numbers are an individual catalog code. Sequence, acquisition date, assigned handler. You're looking at a human inventory system." Kieran sat with the phone against his ear and said nothing. "The specific format," Pell continued, "matches acquisition records I've seen from a network that went dormant about a decade ago. Underground. Very high-end clients, specialized in taking children from specific backgrounds, elite crime families, politicians, military brass, for long-term conditioning programs. The idea was you take them young, you run them through a process, you end up with an asset who has both the original access from their bloodline and the specific capabilities the program builds in. Loyalty through erasure. No original identity left to compete with the programming." A pause. "They were called the Hollow Choir." The name meant nothing to Kieran. "Were," he said. "That's what I said." "You're certain about the format?" "I'm certain about the format. Beyond that," Pell's voice did something careful. "Beyond that, whoever you got this from, Kieran, you should understand that people who come out of these programs carry the programs inside them. The things they were trained to do don't stop because the organization stopped. They're still operational. They're just operational without external direction. Kieran ended the call. He sat in his office in the dark with the city's rainy light coming through the windows and thought about a woman sleeping half awake on a sofa with scarred forearms and numbers on her wrist and a knife deployed in perfect muscle memory technique against a trained security professional in a corridor at 3 in the morning. He thought about the helicopter above the cathedral. They found me again. He opened his laptop and began to pull threads. The research consumed the next 4 days, and what he found was a sediment layer. Each fact buried beneath 3 more facts. Each document leading to a redaction, leading to a shadow archive, leading to an offshore record that required 3 separate contacts to access. He barely slept. He ate standing at the kitchen counter. Serafina passed through the penthouse on her own quiet schedule and watched him with those winter blue eyes but said nothing, and he watched her back and said nothing. And the space between them accumulated a particular pressure. On the 4th night, he found the shipping records. Offshore transfers routed through a Cayman shell, dated 11 years ago. Cargo manifests that described industrial parts, but whose routing coordinates matched no industrial facility, passing instead through a network of private maritime waypoints that Kieran recognized from his own smuggling history as the signature pattern of a network running something that couldn't travel through legitimate ports. He cross-referenced the manifest dates against Drax family records, against the public timeline of Serafina Drax, against the gap. There was a gap. 7 years, visible only if you knew to look for it. A period between the age of 9 and 16 in which Serafina Drax appeared in exactly no photographs, no school records, no social documents of any kind, no public events, no medical records that hadn't been generated by a single private physician operating under a consulting arrangement with the Drax estate. The official story, told once in a single interview Lucian had given to a society page 11 years ago, was that his daughter had been abroad, educated privately in Switzerland, delicate health, private family matters. Switzerland. Kieran had spent time in certain circles where Switzerland was a clean answer you gave when the dirty answer was unavailable. He found the intelligence files on the 5th day through a contact in federal organized crime archives who owed him a very old and very large debt. The files were fragmentary, partially classified, and clearly the survivor of multiple rounds of deliberate deletion. But what remained was enough. The Hollow Choir. A covert acquisition and conditioning network, active from the mid-90s through what appeared to be an abrupt termination event approximately 9 years prior. Not government. Privately funded through a consortium of criminal organizations who'd understood the long-game value of turning bloodline children into controlled assets. Estimated 40 to 60 acquisitions over the program's lifetime. Clients included cartel families, Eastern European syndicates, domestic crime organizations. The consortium list was redacted. Kieran stared at the redaction. He spent the next 3 hours running financial archaeology, following money through the layers of shell structures, tracing the funding flows backward through the years to their sources. Most of the trails went cold. Some of them went to places he recognized. One clean, damning thread that had been missed in the deletion sweeps because it was routed through a series of microtransactions too small to flag automated filters, led to an account structure he knew. He knew it because he had grown up watching it operated. The thread led to the Veil Syndicate, to his father's accounts, to transactions dated 18 months before the fire in the warehouse where Lucy and Drax had left him to die. Kieran sat in his office at 4 in the morning, with the rain still hitting the windows and a glass of water he had poured 2 hours ago and still hadn't touched, and felt the entire architecture of the story he had told himself for 15 years begin to shift under him in the dark. He had come back to destroy Lucy and Drax. He was no longer entirely certain who needed destroying. He was no longer entirely certain what he had married into, or what his own blood had built, or where the floor was in any of this. He took a breath, let it out, pulled the next file. It was a personnel record, fragmentary. An intake log from what the file header described as a processing facility, dated 14 years ago. Asset designation SCH-047-F. The numbers on Serafina Drax's wrist, and below it, one line, the only line in the entire file that had not been redacted. Acquisition source? Drax. L. Voluntarily surrendered. The glass of water hit the desk hard enough to slosh when his hand came down beside it. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Down the corridor, behind the door of the adjacent suite, Serafina Drax was asleep or not asleep, carrying the number SCH-047-F on the inside of her wrist, and her father, the man who had sold her, who had handed his 9-year-old daughter to a trafficking network and spent the following 7 years telling journalists she was in Switzerland, was currently being celebrated in the Blackwater press as one of the city's great patriarchs. Kieran pushed back from the desk. He stood at the window for a long time, with his hands in his pockets and the city laid out below him in the rain-soaked dark. He had come here for Lucien. He was going to get Lucien, but the shape of what that meant had just changed, and changed completely. And somewhere in the renovation of everything he had planned, a new and entirely unwelcome thing was beginning to announce itself. A concern that had nothing to do with revenge, and nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with the woman 30 feet away, who had been sold by her own father at 9 years old, and had somehow, against every probability, walked back out. He pressed a hand flat against the cold glass. The harbor lights moved like slow fire in the water below. He was still standing there when her door opened in the corridor behind him. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, Serafina was in the penthouse doorway in a dark sweater and bare feet, her hair loose, her face carrying the aftermath of whatever the night had done to her. She looked at him across the room, looked at the open laptop, the files spread across the desk. The stillness between them was absolute. She said very quietly, "You found it." He didn't answer. She walked to the window and stood beside him and looked out at the harbor, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the rain and the distant low moan of a tanker somewhere out in the dark water. "How much?" she said. "Do you know?" Kieran looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the particular quality of her stillness, the scars he could see where the sweater's sleeve had ridden up slightly at the wrist. "Enough," he said. She nodded once. She didn't ask him what he was going to do about it. He didn't tell her. But when he looked back out at the harbor, he was no longer thinking about Lucien Drax. He was thinking about a line in a redacted file, voluntarily surrendered. And he was thinking about what it meant that the man who had written those words, who had handed over his own child and then rebuilt a public life on the polished fiction of her absence, was still alive, still operating, still being treated by 300 wedding guests as a patriarch worth celebrating. Not for much longer. The thought arrived with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with revenge anymore, and everything to do with something older and less manageable. He had spent 15 years sharpening himself into a weapon aimed at one man. He was no longer certain one man was enough. Serafina turned from the window. Their eyes met in the dark glass of the reflection. Both of them reflected there together, standing at the edge of everything, the harbor burning cold behind them. "There's something else," she said. He held her gaze in the reflection. "The organization," she said. "The hollow choir." She paused. The pause had weight. The weight of someone choosing words with the carefulness of a person who does not use words carelessly. It didn't stop. The room was very still. "Someone," she said, "is rebuilding it." And then from somewhere below in the building, from the street, from the wet dark city outside, came the sound of a helicopter, closer this time, circling, and Serafina's reflection went very white and very still in the glass. The helicopter made 3 passes. Kieran counted them, the sound swelling and fading, the rotor wash a low vibration that pressed against the penthouse windows like a hand testing the glass for weakness. The 3rd pass came closer than the first 2, and Serafina stopped being a person standing beside him and became something else entirely. Something that had been trained into her at a cellular level, her body dropping into a stillness so complete it was almost a different biological state, breathing reduced to the barest minimum, eyes tracking without moving her head, one hand drifting to her right hip where there was nothing because she was in a sweater and bare feet and had no weapon on her. The absence of the weapon seemed to bother her more than the helicopter itself. Kieran watched her hand find nothing and hover there, and he made a decision in the same moment. "It's a news bird," he said. "Harbor Patrol uses the same frequency corridor. My team would have flagged an approach pattern by now." Her hand dropped. She did not look grateful. She looked like someone who had just caught themselves being corrected in front of a stranger and had filed that experience in the category of things that would not happen again. "How long," she said, "have you been building the file?" "5 days." A pause. "You're fast." "I'm motivated." He turned from the window. "Sit down." "I don't need to. I'm not asking you because I think you need to. I'm asking you because I'm going to talk and I'd prefer not to talk at the back of your head." Something moved across her face. Not compliance. She didn't do compliance, he was already certain of that, but a weighing, a rapid internal calibration. She sat at the edge of the long sofa, straight-backed, bare feet flat on the floor. The posture of someone who sat at the edges of things because it kept the center of the room clear. Kieran stayed standing. "The hollow choir," he said. "Tell me what you know about who's rebuilding it. Tell me what you found in your file first. That's not how this works." "We're married," she said. The word came out flat, without irony or sentiment, a purely administrative designation. That means we're either exchanging information or we're both operating blind in the same space. I've operated blind before. I don't recommend it. He looked at her for a moment. He pulled a chair from the desk and set it across from the sofa and sat. He told her what he'd found. All of it. The shipping records, the intake log, the asset designation, the consortium funding trails. He did it the way he did most things, methodically, without inflection, watching her face the way a surgeon watches a monitor, rather than a wound. She didn't interrupt. When he reached the consortium funding, when he said the word veil, something happened in her eyes that was very brief and very specific, and he cataloged it, not surprise. She already knew. Or she'd suspected and was now having the suspension confirmed, which was a different thing and in some ways harder. "Your father," she said when he stopped. "His accounts, his period. He died 6 years ago. Heart attack." He paused. "Or what was recorded as a heart attack. And Lucian knew you were coming. Lucian thinks I'm a nephew. He doesn't know I survived the warehouse." He let that sit for a beat. "He doesn't know I have the consortium records." Serafina was quiet. Outside, the rain had changed register. Lower, steadier now. A white noise that pressed against the windows and softened the city's edges. "The man rebuilding it," she said finally. "I don't have a name, I have a voice. I have a methodology. I have the specific pattern of how they move people and money, and I've been watching it reassemble for approximately 2 years. She paused. "In the early months, I thought I was wrong, that I was reading patterns into noise because that's what the program trained me to do, pattern recognition above everything else. But I wasn't wrong. 2 years, he said. You've been watching it reassemble for 2 years, and you didn't—" He stopped himself. "Didn't what?" Her voice sharpened. "Go to the authorities? Which authorities?" The Hollow Choir's original client list included 3 federal prosecutors and a sitting appellate judge. I was 9 years old when they took me, and I was 16 when I came back, and nobody, not one person, officially acknowledged that anything had happened. My father rewrote the story, and everyone accepted the rewrite because everyone who mattered was either complicit or afraid. She inhaled. "So no, I didn't go to the authorities. You went back to your father. I had nowhere else to go." The flatness in her voice was absolute. "I was 16. I spoke 4 languages, and I could assemble a field radio in the dark, and I knew 47 ways to make a grown man stop functioning, and I had nowhere to go except back to the man who put me in it." She looked at her hands. "He never talked about it. Not once. He put me in a room in the estate and hired a psychiatrist, and paid the psychiatrist very well to help me become something presentable. And after 2 years, I was presentable enough, and after 10 more, I was useful enough. And then he gave me to you." The room was very quiet. Kieran leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely linked and looked at her with the full focus of someone who had stopped performing any kind of normality for the evening. "The voice," he said. "The man rebuilding it. You've heard him." "Once." She glanced up. "At the ceremony. One of the guests." Everything in Kieran's chest contracted simultaneously. "Who?" "I don't know his name. I know his voice." "There was a man, silver-haired, older, standing near the east colonnade during the reception line. He spoke to my father for approximately 4 minutes. I was 12 feet away." She paused. "I've spent 9 years trying to put a name to that voice. I heard it through walls and over intercoms and from behind doors for 7 years. It was the last thing I heard before the difficult sessions. She stopped. Reset. He was there. At the wedding. At the wedding. Kieran stood up. He crossed to his desk and pulled up the security footage from the ceremony's exterior cameras. His own team's feed, not the Drax security cameras, which he hadn't trusted for a moment. He scrolled through the reception timestamp. Come here. She came and stood beside him, close enough that he could feel the body heat of her in the cool office. She studied the screen without touching it. There, she said. He froze the frame. The man she indicated was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that belonged to men who had spent decades in rooms where everyone else's posture was worse. He was wearing a charcoal suit, and he was not a guest Kieran had vetted, not a name on any list, which meant he was either a late addition by Lucian, or he was something else entirely. Kieran printed the frame. I'll have an ID by morning, he said. You should have it by tonight, she said. If he was there, it means he already knows about the marriage, which means he knows about you, which means whatever timetable he's operating on just changed. Kieran looked at her. She looked back. You understand how these people operate, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. Better than anyone alive, she said, and there was nothing in her voice when she said it. No pride, no bitterness, just the unadorned fact of it, and the fact was devastating in its cleanliness. He sent the image to Pell at midnight. Lucian Drax arrived at the penthouse at 9 the following morning without notice. Kieran heard the lobby call from Toll and was at his desk, jacket on, files closed, coffee cooling at his elbow, by the time the elevator opened. The performance of a man in the midst of a normal morning. He had trained himself years ago to transition into whatever required performance with no discernible interval between the authentic state and the projected one. Lucien came in like he owned the floor. Heavy step, barrel chest forward, thick hands swinging at his sides. 2 of his men stayed in the elevator lobby. One came with him, a newer face, young, carrying the specific suppressed anxiety of a man who hadn't yet been in enough rooms to know whether to be afraid or not. Lucien looked at the penthouse the way men like him always looked at other men's spaces. A rapid territorial survey, cataloging, measuring. Good place, he said. Cold, though. You should get warmer furniture. I'll take it under consideration. Kieran gestured to the sitting area. Coffee? Had coffee. Lucian sat without being invited to. He did it with the ease of a man who had never once waited for permission in a room. He spread his hands on his knees and looked at Kieran with his small, direct, intelligent eyes. Where's Sarah? Asleep, I assume. It's early. My daughter is not a late sleeper, never has been. He paused. She's up. She just doesn't want to see me. That's fine. We have time. He leaned back. I wanted to come by. Talk about the arrangement going forward. You've been married a week, and I haven't heard from you. I've been getting settled. Getting settled? Lucien said it mildly, turning it over. What does that mean? It means I've been assessing the situation before I make any moves. That's how I operate. Lucien looked at him for a moment with an expression that was carefully warm and carefully evaluating simultaneously. The look of a man who had spent decades being both, and had perfected the blend. You're careful, he said. That's good. I like careful. A pause. Your family was not always careful. My family had a lot of difficulties. Your family had a lot of enemies, Lucien said, and there was something in the word enemies that had a slight, deliberate weight, not quite a provocation, close enough to one. Your uncle was a good man, but he made poor decisions in the final years, trusted the wrong people, lost more than he should have. His eyes stayed steady. I hope you're smarter than that. I try to be. Good. Lucien shifted forward. Here's what I want. I want integration. You have reach into the northeastern procurement networks that I've been locked out of for 3 years. Import channels, dock worker arrangements, the Varese connection in particular, which I know you inherited because Varese called me himself to complain that you'd restructured his terms and he was considering walking. You want to know what I told him? He smiled. I told him that my son-in-law was thorough and that if he didn't like the new terms, he was welcome to try to find another arrangement and see what that felt like. The smile settled into something flat. So Varese is not walking, but I need access to those channels within 30 days or the Alliance has no operational meaning. Kieran held his gaze. I'll have my people prepare a structure document. Good. Lucian stood. The survey of the room again, and this time his eyes stopped on the closed office door, the desk visible through the gap, the files that Kieran had closed but whose edges were still visible below the cover document he'd placed over them. You're working on something. Always. Anything I should know about? When there is, you'll know. Lucian nodded. He looked at Kieran for one moment longer than the conversation required, and in that extra moment something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not quite calculation and not quite suspicion, but was the space between them where those two things bred. Take care of her, he said. The sentence had a shape that was not the shape of fatherly concern. It had the shape of instruction. Kieran smiled clean and warm. Of course. After Lucien was gone, Kieran stood in the center of the room and let the smile drop, and stood there without it for a moment. Serafina came out from the corridor. She had been there. He'd known she was there, had registered her stillness around the corner from the sitting area before Lucien arrived, and had not acknowledged it. He knows something's changed, she said. He suspects something's changed. There's a difference. In my experience with Lucien Drax, the interval between suspicion and action is not long. How long? She considered. Days, not weeks. Then we move tonight. Pell came back on the image at 11 that morning, and the name he gave was Draven Meyer. Kieran ran the name through 4 separate networks and got fragments. A former intelligence contractor, Eastern European operations, mid-90s through the early 2000s, multiple organizational affiliations, officially deceased in a car bombing in Riga 9 years prior. The obituary sources were thin and the forensic record thinner, and the specific pattern of the death documentation had the texture of paperwork rather than fact. He was not dead. He was at a wedding. Kieran had a location contact trace started by afternoon, pulling cell tower pings from the ceremony area across the 3 days surrounding the event, running them against known Draven Meyer aliases. It was slow work, and he did it himself rather than delegating because the name was now too hot to hand to anyone whose loyalties hadn't been tested recently. Serafina spent the afternoon in the penthouse gym, which she had discovered on day 2 and which she used with a regularity and an intensity that Kieran had noted from the reports Toll gave him without comment. He went to the gym at 4 in the afternoon to check the cell trace progress on his tablet and found her on the heavy bag, working in bare feet on the canvas floor with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and her hands unwrapped, hitting the bag with the systematic patience of someone who was not exercising but maintaining a calibration. He sat at the bench along the wall. She kept working. The bag swung and she reset it and hit it again. The sounds were clean and controlled. Not rage, not release, just maintenance, like oiling a mechanism. Meyer, he said. Draven Meyer. That mean anything? Her rhythm didn't break. One more combination and then she caught the bag with both forearms and held it, and turned. The name had done something to her face that she had almost controlled. Almost. Where? She said. That's the name on your silver-haired man, former intelligence contractor, officially dead 9 years. She let go of the bag and stood with her breathing elevated but controlled, sweat along her hairline, her hands at her sides. He was the director, she said, of the facility, of the entire Eastern operation. She paused. I watched him kill a 12-year-old boy in front of 14 other children because the boy wouldn't complete an extraction exercise. He did it without any particular feeling, like it was a maintenance task. She looked at Kieran directly. I have thought about him every day for 9 years. You knew him by his face, Kieran said, at the wedding. I knew him by his posture. His face I only saw twice. He wore a mask for most of it, but the way he stands, the way he distributes his weight, the way his head turns when he's evaluating a room. She exhaled. You don't forget the posture of someone like that. You build it into your threat recognition because your survival required it. Kieran looked at her. He wasn't there as a guest, she said. He was there to look at me, to assess whether I was what I appeared to be, the contained, managed daughter, safe and visible and under control, or whether I was a problem. And what did he determine? He determined I was currently managed. She picked up a towel from the bench. He'll reassess that determination when your investigation becomes visible, which it will. People like Meyer have extensive tripwire systems. The file pools you've been running, the Pell contact, the Federal Archive access, those will register somewhere. Maybe not immediately, but they'll register. Kieran stood. How long before they register? A week? Maybe less. She looked at him steadily. We need to know more about the network before it knows about us. That window is closing. I know. He picked up his tablet. At the door, he stopped. You should have told me earlier. She was quiet for a moment. You married me to hurt my father, she said. That wasn't a context that invited disclosure. He looked at her across the gym. The afternoon light from the high windows came across her at a low angle, catching the silver-white scarring on her forearms, the careful neutrality of her expression, the absolute exhaustion she kept perfectly managed beneath the surface. It is now, he said. The confrontation with Lucian happened 3 days later, and it happened because Kieran made it happen, because the cell trace had given him enough of Meyer's movement pattern to understand that the timetable Serafina had predicted was accurate, and because waiting any longer meant operating from the weaker position. He called Lucien and asked for a private meeting. The Drax offices were in a tower in the financial district's northern quarter, not the penthouse floors, but a mid-building set of rooms that Lucien used for business that didn't benefit from being conducted in an obvious location. Kieran came with Toll and left Toll in the corridor and went in alone because bringing security to a conversation like this one was a declaration, and he wasn't ready for declarations yet. Lucien was behind his desk. He looked up when Kieran came in, read something in the way Kieran moved toward the chair, and set down his pen. They looked at each other. You know, Lucien said. I know, Kieran said. No preamble, no diplomacy. The room acknowledged the fact of the statement and moved past it like two men stepping over the same stone. How much? Lucien said. Enough. Kieran sat. The hollow choir, the consortium funding, the intake records. He paused. The acquisition source notation on SCH-047-F. Something moved through Lucien's face. Not guilt, not quite, but something in the same family as shame and further from it than shame should be. He was silent for a moment. That was a long time ago, he said. The sentence was so insufficient for the weight it was carrying that for a moment Kieran could not speak. She was 9 years old, he said, very carefully and very quietly. She was 9 years old and the organization had already identified her as a target. I had a choice between surrendering her in a controlled context or losing her in an uncontrolled one. Lucian's voice was level. The voice of a man who had spent years constructing a justification sturdy enough to live inside. I made a negotiation. I secured terms. I got her back. You got her back at 16, Kieran said. After 7 years, I got her back alive. The word alive arrived with a force that was almost physical. You don't know what the alternatives looked like. You don't know what the hollow choir did to the children whose families didn't cooperate, whose families tried to interfere. I know what they did to her, Kieran said. Lucien stopped. I've seen the scars, Kieran said. I've read the file. I know the methodology. I know what 7 years of that program does to a 9-year-old child. He looked at Lucien across the desk. And I know that you covered it up. You buried the records, you bought the silence, you built a story about Switzerland, and then you brought her home and hired a psychiatrist and made her presentable, and spent the following 12 years using her as a social accessory and finally as a political asset. He paused. You gave her to me. Lucien's jaw was hard. What do you want? He said. The truth. All of it. The consortium. Your role in funding it. And whatever you know about Draven Meyer. The silence that followed had a specific texture. The silence of a man calculating how much truth was survivable. Meyer, Lucien said finally. Meyer is a problem I thought was resolved 9 years ago. I was wrong. He leaned back. The consortium funded the choir jointly for 11 years. Your father's accounts, mine, several others. It was built as an intelligence asset. The idea was access, leverage, trained operatives with bloodline connections. In theory. His mouth tightened. In practice, it became something else. Meyer was supposed to be a program director. He became something else too. By the time anyone on the funding side understood what was actually happening in the facilities, the program had been running for 8 years, and there were 40-odd children in the system, and Meyer had leverage over every single family involved. Leverage, files, records, documentation of every transaction, every consent, every communication. He kept everything. He was always going to keep everything. Lucien looked at Kieran steadily. When the consortium tried to terminate the program 9 years ago, Meyer was supposed to be removed. The car bombing in Riga was arranged by 3 consortium members jointly. It was sloppy work, and everyone involved knew it at the time and chose not to address it. Because addressing it meant acknowledging he was still alive, Kieran said, which meant acknowledging the program. Yes. And now he's rebuilding it. Now he's rebuilding it, Lucien confirmed. And he came to the wedding to determine whether Serafina had become a liability, because she was the one asset who came through the full program and returned to a family position. She's the proof of concept. She's also the most significant living witness to every aspect of the operation. He looked at Kieran with something that might have been as close as Lucien Drax could get to actual fear. If Meyer has decided she's a liability rather than an asset, she has days, not weeks. Kieran stood up. Your father, Lucien said. I want you to understand, your father was not passive in this. He was not dragged in. He was foundational to the early structure. The Vale accounts were the primary funding source for the first 4 years. He held Kieran's gaze. The reason I had to remove him was that he was trying to extract unilaterally and threatened to expose the rest of us when his extraction terms weren't met. A pause. The warehouse, the fire, that was not simply a power play. That was choir business. You were a potential secondary exposure. Kieran stood very still. The warehouse, the wire, the 15 years of careful, patient, burning purpose. Not just a betrayal, a containment operation. He had been 26 years old and he had been left to burn in a building because he was a loose end in a trafficking program that had consumed his father's money and his father's legacy and had taken, among its other costs, a 9-year-old girl named Serafina Drax for 7 years. He looked at Lucien. Lucien looked back. You kept me alive, Kieran said. The realization arrived cold. The fire. Your men set it, but I survived. That wasn't an accident. No, Lucien said quietly. It wasn't. Why? Because you were 26 and you had nothing to do with the program and you had done everything I ever asked of you and… Lucien stopped, looked at his hands. I am not a good man, but I have a specific line I don't cross, and putting a 26-year-old who doesn't know anything in a building and burning it is past that line. He looked up. I let the fire be set. I didn't make sure it finished. The room was very quiet. You owe me 15 years, Kieran said. Yes, and you owe her everything. A long pause. Yes, Lucien said. Kieran walked to the door. Get your people ready, he said without turning around. Meyer knows the marriage happened. He'll move within days. When he does, I'll need the Drax network behind me. You'll have it. Kieran opened the door. And Lucien. He stopped in the doorway. If I find out there's anything else you haven't told me, anything about the program, about Meyer, about what was done in those facilities, the alliance ends and you end with it. He left without waiting for a response. He was 3 blocks from the Drax offices when his phone rang. Toll's number. He picked it up. Sir? Toll's voice had the specific flatness of a man delivering news he had not wanted to acquire. We have a situation at the penthouse. Kieran's pace didn't change. Talk. Mrs. Vale isn't in the building. She left approximately 40 minutes ago through the service exit. She disabled the exterior camera on that corridor. Cleanly, no trace. We only caught it because of the secondary sensor she didn't know about. A pause. She took the photograph of Draven Meyer from your office. And we have a cell ping from a burner registered to a name that doesn't exist, placing her at the Meridian Harbor Freight Yard, Sector 9. Kieran stopped walking. Sector 9 of the Meridian Freight Yard was the location that his cell trace on Meyer's movement pattern had flagged 48 hours earlier as a probable forward position for the rebuilding network's Blackwater logistics operation. She had read his files. Of course she had read his files. "Send the car," he said. "Sir, if Meyer's people are active in Sector 9, send the car now." He was already moving. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the streets were wet and reflective. All the city's lights smeared across the black pavement in long watercolor streaks, and Kieran Vale moved through it at a pace that was not quite running because running was conspicuous, but was as close to running as a man could get, while still looking like he had somewhere specific to be. He had not protected her. He had been 3 miles away building an alliance with the man who had sold her while she walked alone into the freight yard, where the people who had owned her for 7 years were currently setting up infrastructure. She had a knife and 9 years of contained fury and a photograph. He had 4 minutes until the car arrived. The harbor wind came off the water cold and sharp, carrying brine and diesel and the particular electricity of a situation that was about to become something nobody in it could walk back from. He ran. The freight yard at Sector 9 was the kind of place that existed in every port city in the world. The zone where the legitimate infrastructure of commerce gave way to the infrastructure of everything else, where the overhead lights were too far apart and the shadows between containers were deep enough to lose a man in, where the sounds of the harbor covered everything, and the smell of salt water and rust and diesel made the air taste like the inside of something industrial and indifferent to human presence. Kieran came in from the northern perimeter fence. He'd gone over it without breaking pace, the chain link giving a brief metallic complaint under his weight, and landed on the wet gravel on the other side and kept moving. Toll was 60 seconds behind him in the car and had 3 men coming in from the eastern access road, but 60 seconds in a place like this was a geological unit of time, and Kieran was not waiting. He moved between containers with the particular economy of a man who had done this kind of thing before in conditions that were worse. No wasted motion, no unnecessary exposure. His breathing controlled and his eyes in constant adjustment to the low light, reading the yard's geometry as he moved through it. Stacked shadows. Crane silhouettes, the wet gleam of standing water between the rail tracks, the distant red light of a moored barge out in the harbor. He found the first body at the entrance to container row 7. A man, heavy-set, on his back in a puddle with his throat compromised and a look of genuine surprise still on his face. Professional work. Very fast, very clean. The knife angle suggested someone considerably shorter than him, who had come from his left side during a moment of distraction and had known exactly where to apply pressure and for how long. Kieran stepped over him without stopping. He found the second man 30 feet further in, slumped against a container wall, unconscious but breathing. A pressure point application to the carotid, not a kill, which told him something about the state of mind of whoever had been through here ahead of him. Not executing, neutralizing, choosing in real time between lethal and non-lethal options, and selecting non-lethal where the tactical situation permitted. Disciplined. More disciplined than rage would allow. He heard her before he saw her. Not a sound she made, a sound the situation made. The specific acoustic signature of a room that had too many people in it and too much tension. The slight compression of the air inside a large metal container that had its doors cracked open and light coming through the gap and voices, multiple voices, and underneath the voices something else. Something lower and more continuous, an electrical hum that meant equipment. He went to the container doors. Through the gap, a space roughly 12 meters long, converted with the bare minimum of infrastructure. Generator on the left wall, 3 monitors on a folding table, hard drives stacked in a cooling rack, 2 men in dark clothing flanking the far end. And in the center, with her back to the doors and a small caliber pistol leveled at the monitor bank, Serafina. And across from her, seated, unhurried, with the absolute stillness of a man who had spent his entire adult life in situations where other people held the weapons, Draven Meyer. He was older than the wedding photograph had suggested. The silver hair was thinner, the face more deeply cut with the kind of lines that came from decades of interior weather rather than sun. And he was wearing a plain dark jacket with the collar open and his hands were flat on his knees, and he was looking at Serafina with an expression that was the most disturbing thing in the container, which was saying something, because it was not fear, and it was not anger, and it was not the calculation of a man trying to find his exit. It was satisfaction. Kieran pushed through the door. Serafina heard him without turning. "Stay back." "I'm here." "I said stay back." Her voice was the flat operational voice, the one she used when she was running on something below conscious processing. "I have it." "You have it," Kieran said carefully. "And there are 2 armed men 6 feet to your left, and whatever you came here for isn't on this equipment." A pause. "What?" she said. "The drives are blanks," Kieran said, reading the stack configuration from the doorway. He knew the specific housing design, had used the same model himself. It was a decoy rig. The real storage would be elsewhere. "This is a forward position. It's not a data center." Meyer smiled. It was a small smile, barely a movement of his mouth, and it contained within it the specific warmth of a man watching a demonstration that had exceeded his expectations. "He's right," Meyer said. His voice was low and precisely modulated, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that volume was a tool of the amateur and that the most effective deliveries happened below the register that made people defensive. "This is a relay station. You've neutralized 2 of my logistics people and accessed a node that carries approximately 8% of our current operational traffic." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm genuinely impressed by the response time. I expected another 4 days before you found this location." He looked past Serafina to Kieran. "You're faster than your father." The container was very quiet except for the generator hum. "You knew my father," Kieran said. "I knew your father the way I know all of the consortium members, comprehensively." Meyer's hand stayed flat on his knees. Alistair Vale was an interesting man, ambitious in the way that men become when they understand that the formal power structures are insufficient for what they want to accomplish. He came to us with a very clear vision and considerable resources and an understanding of the long-term value proposition that most of our early partners took years to develop. He paused. "He also came to us with you in the early conversations. Before you were born, actually. He was already thinking about the 2nd generation." Something moved through the room. Serafina turned her head slightly, not enough to take her eyes off Meyer, but enough for Kieran to see her profile, the slight tightening at the corner of her jaw. "He planned to put you through the program," Meyer said. "It was in the early consortium agreements. Vale Bloodline, Vale Asset, specific conditioning track." He looked at Kieran with the same measured satisfaction. "He withdrew the arrangement when you were 4 years old, after your mother's illness. He said he'd lost the appetite for it. We accepted the withdrawal because he was still a funding partner and because his other contributions were sufficient." He paused again. "But we kept the file." The floor of Kieran's chest went somewhere cold and distant. "That's not—" He stopped himself. "That's not why you're telling me this." "No," Mir agreed. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that your entire inheritance, every network you rebuilt, every contact you cultivated, every piece of leverage you spent 15 years assembling, is built on a foundation that belongs to us. Your father built his operation inside our infrastructure. When he tried to withdraw and expose the consortium, the infrastructure didn't go with him. It stayed. And when you rebuilt the Vale name, you rebuilt it on top of ours." A pause that had the quality of something final. "You work for me, Mr. Vale. You have been working for me without knowing it for approximately 6 years." The 2 flanking men had their hands near their weapons but hadn't drawn. Kieran ran the geometry. Serafina had the pistol. He had a Glock under his left arm. The 2 men were close enough that getting both of them before either could fire required a sequence that had about a 60% success rate in open space and considerably lower in a confined metal room. "Sarah," he said quietly, "the door's behind us." She understood immediately. Her body orientation shifted by 3 degrees, covering the diagonal. He felt rather than saw her adjust. "I'm not here to threaten you," Meyer said, and he said it with the patience of a man repeating something he's said before and expects to have to say again. "Either of you, I'm here because the situation is more complex than a confrontation resolves, and because Serafina deserves to know the full context before she makes any decisions about what happens next." "She deserves," Kieran said. "Yes." Something in Meyer's voice changed, not softened, but recalibrated, moving to a different register. He looked at Serafina directly. "You were not kept alive because you were a hostage. You were not kept alive because you were a product. You survived 7 years of the most intensive conditioning program we ran because you were extraordinary. Because every assessment, every evaluation, every breaking point we pushed you to, you came through the other side of it intact, not undamaged. Intact. There is a difference, and you know it. He leaned forward slightly. We built something in you that was intended to serve the organization, but what we actually built was something that served only itself. You were the only subject in 43 acquisitions who came out the other side with your own architecture completely preserved. He paused. You were our greatest failure and our greatest achievement. Don't, Serafina said, and the word came out of her like something pressurized, a single syllable with a year's worth of force behind it. I'm not flattering you, I'm providing context. Meyer sat back. The organization is rebuilding. It will rebuild with or without your participation. The infrastructure is too distributed to be stopped by 2 people in a freight yard, but I'm offering you a choice that I've offered no one else. He looked at her steadily. Come back, not as a subject, as a director. You know the methodology better than anyone alive. You know the flaws, the failures, the things that don't work. You could rebuild it correctly. You could have control over what it becomes. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Serafina shot him in the shoulder. The sound in the metal container was enormous, and then everything was motion, Kieran drawing and putting 2 shots into the leftmost flanking man, while the man was still processing the Meyer shot, the second flanking man getting his weapon up, and Serafina already pivoting into him, the pistol in her left hand and her right driving into his weapon arm, with a technique that dislocated his elbow in the same motion as her knee came up into his solar plexus. And then the man was on the floor and the container was still again, and the generator kept humming. Mir was on his side on the chair, holding his shoulder with his good hand, breathing with the controlled rhythm of a man in considerable pain who was managing it deliberately. The wound was not fatal. She'd placed it too far lateral for that, and the placement had been exact. She'd chosen where to put the bullet. She crossed to him and crouched down to his eye level and looked at him from 8 inches away with an expression that Kieran, watching from across the container, had no reference point for. It was not hate, which would have made sense, and it was not satisfaction, which would also have made sense. It was something that had gone past both of those to a place that was emptier and more absolute. I know what you built in me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I've spent 9 years living with it. Every reflex, every threat mapping, every language, every technique. It's mine now, not yours. Mine. She held his gaze. And if you come near either of us again, I will demonstrate what your program produced without the organizational structure you seem to think controls it. She stood up. Mir looked up at her from the floor with that same satisfaction still present underneath the pain. The files, he said. The evidence you think you have. Before you consider going to anyone with it, you should know what's in the full record, not just the pages you've seen, the complete file. He took a breath that caught slightly on the shoulder wound. Specifically the section regarding your father's second negotiation, the one he made 18 months after your acquisition, the addendum he signed. His eyes moved to Kieran, and the Vale countersignature on the same document. Kieran went still. The full consortium agreement, Meyer said, has both families' signatures on the operational expansion clause, including the clause that authorized the detention extension for existing assets in the program. He paused. Your father, Mr. Vale, personally authorized the extension of Serafina Drax's detention period from the original 2-year term to the full 7, in exchange for a restructured funding arrangement that reduced the Vale Syndicate's financial exposure. He looked at Kieran steadily. Alistair Vale kept her in that facility for 5 additional years. The container, the generator, the smell of discharge and salt water. Kieran looked at Serafina. She had gone very still in a way that was different from the operational stillness. This was the stillness of a structure that had just had something foundational removed, still standing out of pure inertia, not yet fully understanding that the ground had moved. She turned slowly and looked at him. Her face asked a question she didn't have words for yet. I didn't know, he said. It came out immediately, and the immediacy was genuine, and it didn't matter. Her eyes stayed on him. I didn't know, he said again. She looked at him for a long moment. Really looked. The way she had looked at things since she was 9 years old, and looking carefully at things was the difference between surviving and not. And then she looked away, at the container wall, at the middle distance, at nothing. "Get the drives," she said. Her voice had no affect whatsoever. "The real ones. He has them on him. Check the jacket's interior left pocket." He did. She was right. They left Meyer breathing on the floor of the container with his satellite phone within reach. Because leaving him unable to call for help was a death sentence she'd apparently decided not to deliver. And they walked out into the harbor night, and the cold, wet air hit them both, and somewhere behind them Toll's vehicle was coming down the service road with its lights off. They did not speak on the walk out. They did not speak on the drive back. The penthouse at midnight had the quality of a place that had absorbed something it couldn't process. Too many lights on, the rain returning against the windows, the harbor below going black and restless under the wind. Kieran put the drives on his desk and stood there with his jacket still on and his hands on the desk's surface and tried to locate something in himself that felt like solid ground. He found very little. Serafina was at the window. She'd been at the window since they came in the same position he'd found her in on their first night here, looking out at the water. But the quality of it was different now. Before, it had been a woman standing in a new and uneasy situation, watching the city she'd returned to. Now it had the quality of someone standing at the edge of a revised understanding of their entire history. "The extension document," she said, without turning. "Would it be in the drives?" He looked at the drives. "Probably." "Then I'd like to see it." "Sarah, I'd like to see it," she said again. Still no effect. Clean and terrible. He connected the drives to the air-gapped laptop he kept for external media and found the file architecture and navigated it for 40 minutes in silence while she stood at the window. He found the consortium documents in the third partition. He found the operational expansion clause. He found the amendment with the detention extension. He found the Vale counter signature, his father's handwriting, a signature he had seen on birthday cards and on the papers that transferred the Vale estate assets after the warehouse fire, and on 100 other documents over the first 26 years of his life. Alistair Vale. And a date. And Serafina Drax's asset designation number beside a checkbox next to a line that read, "Extension authorized, term extended to 84 months from acquisition." 84 months, 7 years. He had been 20 years old when that document was signed. He had been studying overseas, learning the procurement networks Lucian would later try to access through him, becoming the useful thing his father had been building him into. And his father had been in a room somewhere, signing an extension on a 10-year-old girl's detention because it saved him money. He turned the laptop to face the room. Serafina crossed from the window and looked at the screen. She read it completely. She read it with the comprehensive focus that she brought to everything, missing nothing, her eyes moving through every line. When she reached the bottom, she straightened and stood there and looked at the screen for another moment, and then looked away. "How old were you?" she said. 20. "Did you know about the program at all?" "No." He paused. "I knew my father had arrangements I wasn't fully briefed on. I thought it was standard syndicate business. The parts he hadn't brought me into yet." He looked at the document on the screen. "I was 20 and I was stupid in the way that people are stupid when the person who is asking them to be stupid is someone they trust." She was quiet. "That doesn't change what's on that document," he said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They stood on opposite sides of the room with the city between them through the glass and the drives on the desk and the document glowing on the screen and everything that had been constructed between them over the preceding 2 weeks. The careful and tentative, and neither of them would call it trust, but the thing that had been building anyway, sitting in the room like something fragile on a tilting surface. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. "I want to burn all of it down," she said. "The hollow choir, the consortium, everyone connected to it, every politician and judge and crime family that funded or protected it or looked the other way." She paused. "I have wanted that for 9 years. What's changed is that I now have the evidence to actually do it." She gestured toward the drives. "And I have you." He held her gaze. "You don't have to want me for anything," he said. "You have the drives. You can walk out of here tonight with them, and I won't stop you, and I won't follow." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still here." The gala invitation arrived the following morning. It came in a physical envelope, cream-colored, delivered by a courier who had no record of being hired for the delivery and who had been approached in the lobby of a building 3 blocks away by a man matching Draven Meyer's description. The invitation was for the Dominion Hotel's annual summit, a charity event, nominally, an exercise in mutual visibility, practically, attended by every significant power broker in Blackwater's overlapping legitimate and criminal hierarchies. In 4 days, Kieran held the envelope and turned it over and looked at the handwriting on the front. Mr. and Mrs. Vale. Serafina took it from him, read the card, and set it on the table with the precision of someone placing something in a specific location for a specific reason. He's inviting us in, she said. Or summoning us, Kieran said. He took a bullet in the shoulder last night. He's not inviting us because he's gracious. He's inviting us because he wants to demonstrate that he controls the venue, that he controls who's in the room and what happens there. She looked at the card. He wants us surrounded by every person who has a stake in keeping the Hollow Choir's records buried. He wants us to walk in knowing exactly how outnumbered we are. And he wants to offer me the directorship again, in front of an audience, with the implication that declining the second time will not be handled as gently as the first. She looked at Kieran. If I go, he'll try to absorb me back into the organization in a way that ties my participation to your safety and vice versa. Classic leverage architecture. The program manual devotes 40 pages to it. If I don't go, we lose whatever time advantage we currently have. He distributes the drive's contents on his own terms to his own audience, and we spend the next 6 months trying to catch an organization that's already running. She was quiet for a moment. The gala is also the only event in the next month that gets every connected party into the same room. If we're going to use what's on those drives, if we're going to actually bring this down, we need the room. Kieran looked at the invitation. He thought about the freight yard and the container and Meyer's shoulder wound and the drives sitting in his office and the document with his father's signature and the look on Serafina's face when she read it. He thought about the person he'd been when he walked into the cathedral 2 weeks ago. The machinery of 15 years of careful construction clicking into place. The architecture of a revenge so patient and so complete that it had become the load-bearing structure of his entire identity. He thought about the fact that none of it was what he'd thought it was. Not the betrayal, not the warehouse, not the Vale name he'd rebuilt, not the marriage, not even the enemy he'd come back to destroy. All of it had been built on top of something he hadn't known existed, funded by money he hadn't known the source of, running on mechanisms his own father had helped design. He had spent 15 years preparing to burn down one man's house. He had just learned that he was standing inside the house he needed to burn. All right, he said. He picked up the invitation. We go to the gala. Serafina looked at him. And the drives, he said. I know someone in federal organized crime, old debt, someone who isn't on the list. He met her eyes. We send everything to him before we walk in. Full record, full documentation, every name on the consortium agreement. Whether we come out of the Dominion or not, the files go. She held his gaze. Whether we come out, she repeated. Whether we come out, he confirmed. Something moved through her face then. Not relief, nothing as simple as that, but a recalibration. A shifting of something that had been held in a fixed position for a very long time. She looked at him with the full weight of everything she knew about people and what they were capable of, and what they said versus what they did, and whatever the assessment produced, she held it inside and nodded once. Then we have 4 days, she said, and there are things you need to know about how Meyer runs security in a public venue. She sat at the desk. He pulled a chair. She began. Outside the penthouse windows, Blackwater City went about its ordinary corrupt business in the early morning light, 4 days before everything that ran it underground was going to be brought upstairs into the air, and the harbor moved below them, gray and cold and indifferent. And somewhere across the city, in a private medical facility, Draven Meyer was having his shoulder tended to by a physician who did not ask questions, looking at the ceiling, and thinking about what came next with the settled patience of a man who had been thinking about what came next for his entire adult life, and had never once been surprised by the 4 days was not enough time. It was also exactly enough time, because time was the one resource that had a fixed quantity in this situation, and spending any of it mourning the insufficiency was a luxury neither of them could afford. They work through the remaining days with the particular efficiency of people who have stopped performing normalcy for each other and have arrived, through the accumulated weight of shared information and mutual exposure, at something that functioned like an operational partnership without anyone having agreed to call it that. Serafina knew the Hollow Choir's security methodology the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Not from study, but from having been inside it, from having been both the subject of it and, in the program's later years, used as a test instrument to evaluate and refine it. She mapped Meyer's probable venue security deployment across a scaled floor plan of the Dominion Hotel's upper event floors, working from memory and from 2 reconnaissance passes she made on foot during the preceding days, dressed differently each time, moving through the lobby and the bar, and the event coordinator's office she accessed under a false name with a story about a corporate booking. She came back the second time with photographs on a burner phone and a detailed read of the hotel's structural layout that included 3 things the official blueprints didn't show: a service corridor that ran behind the main ballroom's east wall, an emergency generator room accessible from the sub-basement that was on a separate power circuit from the building's main grid, and a maintenance shaft above the ballroom's ceiling space that had access points from both the upper residential floors and the rooftop mechanical room. "He'll put people in the shaft," she said, laying the photographs across the desk. "It's what the program manual recommends for high-ceiling ballroom events: elevated positions, rappel capability, visual coverage of the entire floor from above. He'll have a minimum of 6 in there." She pointed to the ceiling access point. "And he'll cut the main power at a specific moment, not immediately, not as a panic response. When he wants to control the room, when he's ready." "What's the trigger?" Kieran said. "A refusal. A public one. He'll make the offer again in that room, the directorship, or whatever variation he's prepared. And if the answer is no in front of that audience, the power goes and the room becomes his." She looked at the photographs. "He'll want every person there to see that declining him has a cost. It's a demonstration. For the consortium survivors. For everyone. The politicians, the judges, the families. A reminder of what the organization can do in a room full of people who think they're safe." She paused. "He did it before. Twice. In the program's active years. Events where a funding partner tried to renegotiate terms. He waited until they were in public, and then he made the room very small." Kieran looked at the floor plan. "The generator room," he said. "Yes. If we get someone into the generator room before the event, we control when the power goes," she said, "or whether it goes at all." He looked at her. She looked back. "We'd need the power to go," she said, "just not on his schedule, on ours." The planning consumed the remaining days. Kieran moved money through 3 clean accounts to source equipment and personnel. Not his regular network, none of the Drax-adjacent contacts, only the people who had been with him since before the return to Blackwater, the ones whose loyalty had been tested by circumstances that predated any of this. He briefed them in pieces, no one person holding the full picture, each element compartmentalized the way you compartmentalized things when the failure of one component couldn't be allowed to compromise the whole. The drives went to his federal contact on the 3rd day. He drove them personally to a parking structure in the warehouse district and handed them through a car window to a man named Deakins, who had been trying to build a case against Blackwater's organized crime infrastructure for 11 years, and who received the drives with the expression of a man who has just been handed the answer to a question he'd stopped believing was answerable. "This goes out if we don't check in by midnight on the 4th day, Kieran said. "And if you do check in, then we'll talk about the rollout sequence, how to do it in a way that actually lands instead of getting buried." He held Deacon's gaze through the car window. "There are federal names on those drives. Sitting judges. People who will use every tool at their disposal to suppress this if they see it coming." Deakins looked at the drives in his hands. "I know what to do with material like this." "I know you do. That's why you're holding it." He drove back to the penthouse through the evening traffic and found Serafina at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and the Dominion floor plan, and a small notebook in which she had been writing in a compact, precise hand that was not quite any alphabet he recognized, a modified notation system, he suspected, developed through years of recording things in environments where the recording couldn't be legible to anyone else. She looked up when he came in. "Done," he said. She nodded and looked back down at the floor plan. He poured himself water and leaned against the counter, and watched her work and thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago she had been a photograph on a table, a means to an end, a name attached to a bloodline he intended to use and discard, and that he was now standing in his own kitchen at 9 in the evening, watching her annotate a tactical floor plan in a private notation system and feeling something in his chest that he had no immediate category for and did not have the time or the inclination to examine carefully. He drank his water. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's the last prep day." She didn't look up. "You get some sleep." He almost smiled. He didn't. But what? The night of the gala came in cold and clear. The rain finally gone. The harbor flat and dark under a sky that had shed its clouds and gone to open black with the city's light pollution pushing back against it from below. Blackwater looked almost clean from above, the towers lit and the harbor reflecting them, and the streets moving with the ordinary traffic of a Thursday evening. Civilians, unaware that the upper floors of the Dominion Hotel were assembling a room full of people who had spent decades running things in the dark. Kieran wore a black suit, no tie. Serafina wore a dark red dress that fitted against her like a second architecture, structured at the shoulder, falling to mid-calf, the sleeves long, the back high. Nothing visible that wasn't intended to be visible. She had done her own hair and her own face with the particular precision she brought to everything, and she came out of her suite at 8:45 and looked at Kieran across the penthouse, and something passed between them that was not a conversation. "Ready?" she said. "Yes." They went down. The Dominion Hotel's grand ballroom occupied the 42nd and 43rd floors of the Obsidian Tower on Harbor Boulevard, a double-height space with a glass ceiling that looked out over the city's skyline and which had been fitted for the evening with crystal chandeliers and a full orchestra on a raised platform and tables along the perimeter laid with the kind of precision that required 3 catering staff per table. The guest list ran to 240. The room smelled of cut flowers and champagne and the specific expensive neutrality of a space that had been professionally scented to suggest that nothing unpleasant could occur within it. Kieran and Serafina moved through the room with the ease of 2 people who had been in rooms like this before and understood that the room was a performance, and the performance required that everyone within it maintain the collective fiction of their own respectability. He took a glass of water from a passing tray. She took nothing. They worked the perimeter, exchanging the minimal social interactions required by the event's architecture, and Kieran was simultaneously reading the room's security topology. 6 Dominion staff who weren't Dominion staff, 3 individuals on the upper mezzanine who were positioned rather than present, 2 men near the service corridor entrance who had the same lapel cut as the flanking men from the freight yard container. Myers' people. 11 visible, which meant more he couldn't see. His own people were in position. Cress in the generator room, access through the service entrance 90 minutes before the event began. 2 others on the rooftop above the ceiling shaft access. Toll in the lobby with a vehicle and a very specific set of instructions for a very specific sequence of events. He checked his watch. 9:14. He found Lucien Drax at the far end of the room near the orchestra platform, talking to a man in a navy suit who Kieran recognized from the consortium documents as a state appellate judge. Lucien saw him coming and extracted himself from the conversation and met him part way. "You came," Lucien said. "We were invited," Kieran said. Lucien looked at him with those small, careful eyes. "You look like a man who has already decided something. Most men at these events have already decided something. Most men here have decided what they're willing to trade and for how much." Lucien glanced toward Serafina, who was 20 feet away in apparent conversation with a woman Kieran didn't recognize. "She knows what tonight is." "She knows more about tonight than anyone in this room," Kieran said, "including the man who sent the invitation." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "You're going to do something." "I'm going to finish something," Kieran said. "The question is whether you're standing on the right side of the room when it happens." Lucien looked at him. "What do you need?" he said. "When the lights go, keep your people calm and keep them near the east wall. Service corridor access. Don't let your security engage anyone unless someone comes directly at you." "And Sarah?" "She's not yours to manage tonight," Kieran said. "She hasn't been yours to manage for a long time." Something crossed Lucien's face. Not argument, not protest, but the specific expression of a man receiving a truth he has known for years and has finally stopped having the energy to refuse. He looked old, in that moment. Not weak, just old, and carrying a very long weight, and perhaps beginning to understand that the weight was not going to be redistributed into something more manageable by any action available to him. He nodded. Kieran moved back into the room. At 9:47, Dravenmire arrived. He came in from the mezzanine level, appearing at the upper railing with his silver hair and his dark suit and his shoulder held with the slight careful carriage of a man managing a recent wound, and he looked down at the ballroom floor with the expression of a man surveying something he owns. The sling was gone. He'd chosen not to wear it, Kieran noted, because a sling was a vulnerability display, and Meyer did not display vulnerabilities in rooms he controlled. His eyes found Kieran first, then Serafina. He came down the mezzanine stairs and moved through the room with the unhurried precision of someone who knew the geometry of every obstacle around him and had pre-calculated every path. People moved aside for him without entirely understanding why they were doing it. The specific social gravity of a man whose presence communicated at a frequency below conscious processing that his passage took priority. He reached them at the room's center. Mr. Vale. A nod. Then to Serafina. You look well. I look like someone who shot you 4 days ago, she said. That's different from well. Something flickered in his eyes. Not offense. Appreciation, possibly. Fair. He glanced at the room around them. The orchestra playing, the guests distributed across the space in their clusters of commerce and alliance and mutual performance. Quite a gathering. You put it together, Kieran said. I curated it. It assembles itself. People like this have their own gravity. He straightened his jacket with his good hand. I thought a public venue was appropriate for a public conversation. He looked at Serafina. You understand what I'm asking. I made it clear in the container. You made it clear, she said. I also made my answer clear. Your answer in the container was impulsive. I'm asking you to consider it with more time. His voice was low and utterly level, designed to be heard by the three of them and no one else. The organization is not what it was. The acquisition program is not being restarted in its prior form. That methodology has limitations that the program's history demonstrates. What I'm building is different, smaller, more selective, an intelligence network, not a, he paused, selecting the word carefully, a manufacturing operation. You're putting children through a system that breaks them, Serafina said, regardless of the scale. I'm offering you the authority to determine what the system is. His eyes were steady. You have the standing. You have the knowledge. You have the specific experiential authority that no one else in this organization can claim. If you believe the prior methodology was wrong, and you've had 9 years to form that belief, then you have the ability, in the position I'm offering, to build something different. He looked at Kieran. Both of you. The Vale network integrated with the choir's infrastructure, with the documentation leverage that provides. You'd be the most protected operational unit on the eastern seaboard. The orchestra finished its piece and began another. Glasses clinked somewhere behind them. Kieran looked at Meyer and felt the room around him. The weight of 240 people who needed this conversation to have a specific outcome, who had decades of complicity to protect, who would not consider the cost of that protection in the personal and human terms that the cost actually existed in. He felt the weight of his father's signature on a document that had kept a 10-year-old girl in a facility for 5 years beyond the already unconscionable original term. He felt the weight of 15 years of a purpose that had turned out to be built on a foundation he hadn't understood. No, he said. Simple. Flat. Final as a door closing. Mir looked at him, then at Serafina. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Mir was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked up, briefly, toward the mezzanine. A signal. The smallest possible signal. Not a gesture, not a word, just the direction of his gaze for 1 second and then back. Kieran had been waiting for it. Cress, he said quietly, his hand moving to his earpiece. And the lights went out, not on Meyer's schedule. 12 seconds before Meyer's schedule, because Cress had been watching the generator room's external sensor feed and had identified the Meyer operative who arrived to execute the power cut approximately 90 seconds before the signal, and had handled the operative and executed the cut himself on Kieran's standby command. The ballroom went black. The orchestra stopped. 240 people in a room that was suddenly dark and silent generated a sound that was not quite screaming and not quite silence. A collective sharp intake, a scraping of chairs, heels on marble, someone's glass shattering, voices beginning to multiply and register in anxiety. And then the ceiling erupted. 6 rappel lines dropping simultaneously from the ceiling access points. 6 Meyer operatives descending in the dark with weapons and lights, exactly as Serafina had predicted and Kieran had planned for, and the lights from their equipment swept the ballroom in cutting white beams that caught the crowd in its frozen disarray of evening wear and terror. What Meyer's operatives found when they hit the floor was not the contained, surrounded couple they'd been deployed to control. Kieran was already moving. He went left hard into the operational geometry he'd mapped over the preceding 4 days, the rehearsed route through the ballroom's table configuration that took him to the first descending operative before the man's feet fully hit the marble. The operative was good, trained, fast, already swinging the weapon line to cover, but he'd spent his descent with his eyes adjusting from the ceiling dark to the ballroom dark, and Kieran had spent 4 days with the floor plan and knew exactly where the man's feet were going to land. The impact was brief and complete. The weapon was in Kieran's hand before the operative finished landing. Across the room, in the chaos of sweeping lights and screaming guests, Serafina had done something that Kieran registered in peripheral vision and which would have, in any other context, stopped him entirely. She had moved into the light beams rather than away from them, using the operative's own illumination as a navigation system, reading their positions from the light sources, the way you read a map, moving between the beams with a precision that reduced her profile to practically nothing and put her inside the reach of the second operative's line before he'd completed his rappel. The second operative didn't finish his rappel. 2 down. Meyer was moving toward the service corridor. Kieran saw it in the fractured light. The silver-haired figure making for the east wall, one of his flanking men cutting a path through the fleeing guests, using the crowd as cover and interference. Smart. Practiced. The movement of someone who had planned for the scenario in which the scenario went wrong. He went after him. The ballroom was full of motion and noise now. Guests streaming for the exits. The Meyer operatives on the floor trying to reorient. Lucian Drax's security team near the east wall holding their position the way Kieran had instructed. Kieran moved through it all with the fixed focus of a man who had reduced the room to a single point. The flanking man came out of the crowd at him from the left. Kieran took the hit, let it come, absorbed it with his right shoulder, felt the impact go through the joint and up into his neck as he turned into it, and used the man's own momentum to put him into the overturned table to his right. The edge of the table caught the man across the kidney region, and he went down, making a sound that was not a word. His shoulder was wrong, not broken, but wrong. The joint singing with a sharp, insistent frequency that he categorized as a problem to be addressed later and filed away. He kept moving. The service corridor door was open. He went through. The service corridor was a different world from the ballroom. Narrow, fluorescent lit in sections, the walls bare concrete and exposed conduit, the sounds of the building's mechanical systems present and close. The corridor ran the length of the east wall and then angled south toward the freight elevator bank, and Kieran moved along it fast, his shoulder sending its signal with increasing insistence, the weapon he'd taken from the operative in his right hand. He heard them ahead, footsteps, 2 sets, one heavier than the other, moving at pace. He came around the angle of the corridor and saw them. Meyer and the flanking man 20 feet ahead reaching the freight elevator. The elevator doors were already open, held open, which meant there was someone in the car waiting to receive them, which meant Meyer had planned the exit route with his characteristic thoroughness. "Meyer," Kieran said. His voice in the corridor was flat and very loud against the concrete. Meyer stopped. He turned. The flanking man had a weapon up in the same motion, pointed at Kieran's chest, and Kieran held his own weapon level, and they stood in the narrow corridor with the fluorescent light humming overhead and 20 feet between them. "Let him go," Meyer said to the flanking man. The man lowered the weapon slowly. Meyer looked at Kieran across the distance. "The drives are already in federal hands," Kieran said. "Deacons at the organized crime unit before tonight. It goes public whether I walk out of here or not." Meyer was quiet. His shoulder was clearly hurting. The suit jacket on that side had a darkness spreading near the seam that suggested the wound had reopened, possibly during the ballroom movement. His face was very controlled and very pale. "I know," Meyer said. Kieran went still. "I know about Deacons," Meyer said. "I know you transferred the drives on Thursday. I know the federal contact." He looked at Kieran with something that was almost tiredness. "I've known about your investigation since day 4. The Pell contact registered in our network within hours. The archive access the following day." A pause. "I let it continue because the investigation's outcome doesn't change the material situation. The material situation is that the full consortium record is in federal hands," Kieran said. "The material situation," Meyer said carefully, "is that the consortium record has been in federal hands twice before. In 2009 and again in 2014. Both times, the relevant personnel at the relevant agencies ensured that the material was absorbed and contained. Both times, the specific federal contacts who received the material were on the consortium payroll." He paused. "Deacons has been on our payroll for 3 years." The corridor. The fluorescent light. The shoulder wound signal turning from insistent to demanding. "You're lying," Kieran said. "I'm not. And you know I'm not." Meyer held his gaze. "Check his accounts. The transfers are in the consortium record you gave him. 3 years of deposits from a shell in the Caymans that any competent forensic accountant will connect back to the choir's financial infrastructure. You handed the evidence against him directly to him." He paused. "The drives are gone. The federal window is closed." Kieran's hand on the weapon was steady. His chest was not steady. "So here we are," Meyer said, "without the leverage you planned to use, without the exit you arranged. And I'm going to ask you again. Not the partnership, not the directorship. I understand the answer to those questions. I'm going to ask you a simpler question." He looked at Kieran directly. "What are you willing to do to end this? Not expose it. End it. Completely. Permanently." From behind Kieran, in the corridor, footsteps. He didn't turn. He knew the sound. Serafina came alongside him, and she was breathing hard, and there was blood on her left forearm that was not hers from the cut of someone else's work, and her dress was torn at the shoulder seam, and she looked at Meyer across the corridor with an expression that Kieran had not seen on her before. Not the operational emptiness, not the managed blankness, but something raw and absolutely present. Like everything she'd spent years covering had come to the surface all at once, and she had decided, in the last few minutes, to let it stay there. She looked at Meyer for a long moment. Then she looked at Kieran. "Deacons," she said. "He's—" "I know," Kieran said. She absorbed that. 1 breath, 2. "Then the gala was for nothing," she said. "Not for nothing." He looked at her. "We're standing in a corridor with the man who ran the program, and his organization just lost its public venue and 6 of its operatives, and whatever the consortium attendees thought they were buying tonight is not what they walked into." He held her gaze. "The leverage play didn't work. We go to the source." She looked at him. "The submarine dock," she said. "Yes." Meyer had gone very still. Kieran looked back at him. "The Meridian Harbor facility," Kieran said. "The one you've been using as the rebuild's primary infrastructure hub. My cell trace puts it in the abandoned dock complex at the South Harbor." He watched Meyer's face. "We're going there tonight, and we're not going there to negotiate." Meyer looked at him across the 20 feet of corridor with the fluorescent light aging them both. "You don't have the resources to take that facility," he said. "Not after tonight. You've spent most of what you came here with." "I have enough," Kieran said. "You'll die in there." "Maybe," Kieran said. "You'll definitely die in there." A silence. Then Meyer said, with the absolute quietness of a man who has spent a lifetime saying things he means completely, "I want you to understand that I don't lose." "You lost the ballroom," Serafina said. Her voice was perfectly flat and perfectly final, and the 3 words sat in the corridor like something dropped from a height. Meyer looked at her. He looked at the weapon in Kieran's hand. He looked at the elevator doors still open behind him. And then he looked back at them both with the expression of a man who is performing a very rapid recalculation and arriving at an answer that he does not like and is not going to show. "The dock," he said. "You want to end it there?" "I want to end it," Kieran said. "The where is practical." Meyer straightened. He adjusted his jacket with his good hand. He looked at Kieran and Serafina standing side by side in the narrow corridor with the concrete walls close and the light overhead and the sound of the building around them and the city outside. and the harbor beyond that, cold and flat and waiting. "Then come," he said. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Kieran stood in the corridor for a moment with the weapon in his hand and his shoulder wrong, and the certainty that everything he'd planned for this evening was gone, and what remained was a direct assault on a fortified facility with insufficient resources against an opponent who had spent 9 years building toward this specific moment. He looked at Serafina. She looked back. Her breathing had regulated. The blood on her forearm had dried. Her eyes were carrying everything: the freight yard, the container, the document with his father's signature, the gala's chaos, deacons, the drives, all of it, carrying it with the particular capacity of someone whose load-bearing tolerance had been built by things that made tonight look. The South Harbor at midnight was the end of the world dressed up as infrastructure. The abandoned submarine dock complex sat at the furthest reach of the Meridian Harbor's industrial peninsula, separated from the working port by a half-mile of decommissioned rail yard and chain-link fencing that had been cut and resealed so many times along its length that the repairs had become part of its original design. The water here was black and still in the pocket between the concrete breakwaters, undisturbed by the harbor traffic further north, and the smell was different, older, heavier, the salt and diesel underlaid by something mineral and cold that belonged to enclosed water that had been sitting in the same stone channel for decades. The dock complex itself was 3 connected structures: a main above-ground warehouse building that had been converted into operations space, a submarine bay that ran beneath the warehouse floor and opened to the harbor through a submerged gate, and a series of lower detention and utility corridors that connected the 2 principal structures through the bedrock. The whole thing was dark from the outside. No lights, no visible activity, the kind of darkness that was too complete and too consistent to be natural. Meyer had gone in ahead of them. He'd had 22 minutes. "He'll have pulled everyone in from the Gala network," Serafina said. They were crouched behind a rusted equipment shed at the complex's northern perimeter, Toll beside them, and 2 of Kieran's remaining men flanking the approach. The shoulder wound had been field-dressed in the car with tape and gauze from the kit in the glove compartment, and it had stopped bleeding but had not stopped its signal, which had upgraded from demanding to a continuous blunt frequency that lived behind Kieran's right eye. He had stopped acknowledging it. "He knows we're coming. This isn't an approach on an unprepared position." "How many?" Kieran said. "Inside the building, probably 12 to 15. The corridors will have fewer they're single-file spaces. He'll use them as kill zones rather than defensive positions." She was looking at the complex with her eyes moving in that constant, systematic sweep, reading the architecture the way she read everything. "He'll put his best people at the main entrance and the submarine bay access. The corridors he'll leave lightly covered and let the geometry do the work." "The generator," Toll said. "There'll be a backup here that doesn't run through external infrastructure. He'll have planned for a power cut approach." She paused. "The corridors will have emergency lighting, red, low. It'll work against us more than him. His people know the layout, ours don't." Kieran looked at the complex. He was running numbers that didn't add up to a comfortable outcome. 2 of his men were still at the Dominion managing the post-gala situation and couldn't be recalled in time. The 4 he had here were solid but insufficient for a frontal approach on a prepared position with 12 to 15 defenders. The shoulder was a liability he couldn't fully account for. Meyer had 22 minutes and a lifetime of contingency planning. He looked at Serafina. "The corridor layout," he said. "You know it. I know the methodology. I know how the choir builds these facilities. The structural logic is consistent across all their locations. I've been in 4 of them." She looked at him. "I don't know this specific building, but you can read it as you go." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Then we go in the way they won't expect," he said. "Not the main entrance, the submarine bay." Toll looked at him. "The water. The submerged gate. It opens to the harbor. If the gate isn't sealed from the inside, we can come up through the bay." He held Serafina's gaze. "Can you swim?" "Can I swim?" she repeated, flatly. "Cold harbor water. Underwater gate transit. Probably 40, 50 meters." She looked at him with an expression that said she had done things that made harbor swimming look like a recreational activity and chose not to enumerate them. "Yes." "Good." Toll said, "Sir, your shoulder is not your concern right now." Kieran checked his weapon, stripped the jacket, left it on the equipment shed. The cold came through his shirt immediately, a sharp, clarifying cold that reset the shoulder's signal into something sharper and more useful. You and the others take the main entrance. Not a frontal assault. Controlled pressure. Make noise. Make them commit defenders to the front. He looked at Toll steadily. You're the distraction, not the assault. Don't die being a distraction. Toll had been with him for 11 years and had heard variations on this speech before. He nodded once. 4 minutes, Kieran said. Then the main entrance. He and Serafina went into the harbor. The water was the coldest thing he had ever been in. It hit him like a physical argument, his entire respiratory system trying to override the decision to be here, his lungs compressing, the cold driving inward through the shirt and against the shoulder wrap and into the joint itself, where it did something extraordinary and terrible simultaneously, the pain spiking and then converting into a numbing that was worse in its implications than the pain had been. He controlled the breath, controlled the buoyancy, moved. Serafina was ahead of him. She moved through the water with the economy of someone who had been trained in closed water navigation and whose body retained that training the way it retained everything else, below the level of decision as pure function. He followed her line, matching her depth, keeping the harbor wall to his left as they worked around the southern face of the dock structure toward the submarine bay's exterior opening. The gate was a heavy steel panel mounted in the concrete face of the dock's foundation, designed to seal the bay from harbor access. It was not sealed. The gap at the bottom was 18 inches, deliberate, Serafina's hand signal indicated, pointing at the gap's uniform clearance. Not deterioration, left open, maintained open. A secondary access route that Meyer had factored into the facility's design because Meyer factored everything into everything. She went through first. He followed. The inside of the submarine bay was a vast, cold, echoing dark. The water black and the ceiling invisible above it, and the concrete walls visible only as a slightly less dark darkness at the edges of his vision. A metal ladder on the near wall, rusted but solid. He came up at first this time, the shoulder screaming as he cleared the water's resistance and took his own weight on the rungs, and was over the edge and on the dock floor and had the weapon up before Serafina was halfway out. Nothing moved. The bay was empty of people. Full of infrastructure, old equipment, cable runs, the heavy hydraulic hardware of the submarine gate system, and along the far wall, newer additions. Server racks and cooling housings, equipment he recognized as the physical backbone of a serious distributed communications network, and 3 large document safes bolted to the floor. The real archive, not the drives. Those were fragments. This was the whole. Serafina came up beside him, dripping, her hair flat against her face, and she looked at the safes and then at the door in the far wall that led to the corridor system, and her jaw did something small and contained. He kept everything down here, she said. Yes, he was always going to use it. She looked at the safes, not just as leverage, as proof of concept, documentation that the program worked, that it produced what he said it would produce. Her voice was very even. He wanted a record of achievement. Kieran looked at the door. From above them, muffled through the warehouse floor, the sound of Toll's approach beginning, controlled gunfire, structured, doing its work as distraction. The corridors, he said, take me through. The red emergency lighting turned the corridors into something from a different category of experience. The low crimson wash flattening all depth, making the walls feel closer than they were, reducing everything to silhouette and shadow. The sound from above was louder in the corridors, transmitted through the concrete with a directness that made it feel closer and more chaotic than it was. The first contact came at the second junction. A mere operative, yet young, positioned at the corner with a rifle and the training to hold his position. What he didn't have was a read on the approach vector. He was covering the corridor entrance from the dock-level stairwell, not the submarine bay access, and Serafina came from the angle he wasn't watching. She didn't use the knife. She used the wall. The specific application was brief and completely professional, and the man was on the floor making no sound within 4 seconds. And she was up and moving, and Kieran was behind her, and they were past the junction before the echo of the movement had finished in the concrete walls. The second operative they heard before they saw him and Kieran handled it with a low shot that was not lethal because the operative's body armor redirected the impact into a rib group and the man went down unable to function, but breathing. The third junction opened into a wider space, a monitoring room, 6 screens, 2 people. Kieran took the left. Serafina took the right. It was over in the time it took to cross the room. She sat at the monitoring console, and her hands moved across the keyboard with the specific fluency of someone who had spent years being forced to learn systems like this one and had retained the knowledge the same way she retained everything, involuntarily, permanently. She pulled up the facility map. "Here," she said, pointing at the screen. A room at the corridor system's deepest point, below the main warehouse floor, at the same level as the submarine bay but on the opposite end of the structure. He'll be there. It's the only space in the facility with external access independent of the main structure. She traced the route with her finger. 2 corridors. 1 more junction. How many defenders between here and there? She looked at the security camera feeds on the adjacent screens. 2 of the 4 cameras in the corridor system were still live. 1 showed an empty passage. 1 showed a passage with a single operative at the far end. 1 more we can see, she said, which means 1 more we can't. Kieran looked at his weapon. The magazine had 2 rounds less than it should have. How far is the room from the submarine bay? She measured on the screen. 30 meters. He looked at her. If I flush him out from the room and drive him toward the bay, can you cut him off? She looked at the map for a moment. Yes, she said. He believed her. He went alone through the last corridor. The shoulder had crossed from numbing back into pain, which he understood as the cold wearing off and the tissue reasserting its damage report. He processed it as information and kept moving. The red light made the concrete walls look like the inside of something organic, lung-like, hot-colored, close. He moved past the last junction, and the operative he couldn't see came from the alcove he'd predicted, and Kieran took the hit across his left side, felt a rib report something sharp and immediate. And the operative was larger than the previous ones and had the training to close and grapple rather than create distance. And there was a period of perhaps 12 seconds in the corridor that was not graceful and not clean, and that cost Kieran the use of his right arm from the shoulder down for the duration. He finished it with his left hand and a section of exposed conduit from the wall. The operative was alive. Kieran was not entirely certain he was going to remain upright. He leaned against the wall for a moment in the red light and took inventory. Shoulder, non-functional. Rib, compromised. Breathing functional but expensive. Left side, intact. Weapon, in his left hand and operational. The room door, 12 feet ahead. He got off the wall. He went to the door. He opened it. Draven Meyer was at a desk. He was sitting at a desk in the center of a room that was larger than the corridors, the ceiling higher, the equipment more concentrated. More servers, more safes, and along one entire wall, floor to ceiling, a grid of printed photographs and documents, and connecting lines that was the physical manifestation of the organization's architecture, pinned and strung across the concrete with the obsessive completeness of a man who had spent years building something he intended to outlast himself. He had a weapon on the desk within reach. He didn't reach for it. He looked at Kieran in the doorway, at the shoulder, the rib, the weapon in the left hand, the overall condition, and something in his face did what it always did, assessed, calculated, and arrived at an answer that it kept entirely interior. "You made it through," he said. Kieran crossed the room. He stopped 6 feet from the desk, weapon up, and his breathing was doing what it needed to do and nothing else. "Where are the detonators?" he said. Meyer looked at him. "The building is rigged," Kieran said. "It was rigged before we came in. You'd have planned for the scenario where the facility is compromised. You plan for every scenario. There are explosives in this structure, and you have the detonator." He held Meyer's gaze. "I want them. Now." A silence. "Side drawer," Meyer said. "Left." Kieran didn't move to the desk. "Slide it across." Meyer opened the drawer and removed a device. Small, black, 2 switches, a guard cover over the activation, and placed it on the desk surface and pushed it toward the edge. Kieran took it with his left hand without lowering the weapon and put it in his pocket. Meyer watched him. "How many people have you lost tonight?" Meyer said. "None of yours to count." "How many of mine?" "Enough." Meyer looked at the wall behind him, the map, the grid, the architecture of everything he'd built. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has spent his entire life constructing and is in the process of understanding he will never see completed. I want you to know, he said, that I believe in what I built. I understand that you don't. I understand that from your position, the program was a specific category of crime with specific victims and a specific moral weight. I'm not arguing the point. He looked back at Kieran. I'm telling you that for mine, it was a coherent vision of how power is cultivated and sustained across generations, and that every decision I made within it was made in full understanding of its costs and in genuine conviction that those costs were justified by the product. He paused. I want you to know that because I want you to understand that you're not ending something that was monstrous in spite of itself. You're ending something that was built to be exactly what it is. I know, Kieran said. That's why I'm ending it. The door behind him opened. Serafina came through. She was wet and she had a cut along her left cheekbone, and she was carrying a weapon she'd acquired somewhere in the corridors. And she stopped just inside the door and looked at Mir across the room, and the room contracted around the three of them into something that had the quality of a long time arriving at its point. She looked at the wall, at the photographs, at the documents, at the children's case files in the grid's upper section, photographs of faces, ages listed, dates, designations. She looked at them long enough to find what she was looking for, and when she found it, her face did something that Kieran watched and could not fully name. Not grief, because she had processed grief in some private architecture over 9 years, but the specific raw exposure of seeing your own history displayed as an administrative record, a line in a grid, a photograph of a child's face next to a catalog number. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Meyer. I need you to hear something, she said. Her voice was very quiet and very clear. I was 9 years old, she said. I had a room in my father's house with yellow curtains. I had a dog named after a color I can't remember anymore because I've spent 20 years trying not to remember things from before, and some of them went before I chose to let them go. She looked at him steadily. I spent 7 years in your facilities being built into something you designed, and everything you built, every reflex, every language, every capability, I have used for 9 years to survive in the world your program sent me back into. Not for you, for me. She paused. I want you to know that. Whatever you believe you created, I took it from you. It's mine. It has been mine since the day I walked out. Mir looked at her. I know, he said quietly. That's what I told you in the container. You were the only one who... I'm not telling you because I want your acknowledgement, she said. I'm telling you because this is the last conversation you're going to have. And I want the last thing you understand to be that the thing you built most completely is standing in front of you, pointing a weapon at you, and every single part of your investment turned against you the moment it had the capacity to make a choice. Mir was quiet. He looked at her with those eyes that had spent a lifetime calculating and was not calculating now, was doing something else. Something that might have been the closest he came to understanding that there was a category of accounting in which his ledger had no recoverable balance. He looked at the detonator in Kieran's pocket. You should know, he said, that there's a secondary system, not in that device, timed, 40 minutes from the moment I entered this room. He looked at Kieran. You have approximately 16 minutes. Kieran looked at him. The archive, he said, burns with the building. Meyer's voice was steady. Every file, every record, every piece of evidence your federal contact failed to preserve. The wall. He gestured behind him. All of it. He paused. You can stop it. The secondary trigger panel is in the submarine bay, hardwired to the system. You have the time. You'd have to leave this room now. They looked at each other. Or, Mir said, you stay. And we settle it the way it should be settled. And the building takes the archive and the evidence and this conversation, and all three of us, and the organization loses its director and its physical infrastructure, but survives, because the people and the money and the network exist outside these walls and will reconstitute in time. He looked at Kieran. Your choice. Kieran looked at the wall, at the case files, at the names, at the photograph grid that represented 43 children. He took the detonator out of his pocket. He looked at Serafina. She looked back. He made the decision in the same moment she did, and he knew, looking at her, that they had made the same one. He turned and walked out of the room. Oh shit. She was one step behind him, and then she was beside him, and they were moving through the corridor at a pace that was not quite running, and then was running. Kieran's rib filing its complaint at every stride and his shoulder swinging with the uselessness of something that had disconnected from the system, and the red emergency light strobed past them as they went. Behind them, a single shot. One shot, in the room they'd left. Neither of them slowed. The submarine bay was 60 seconds at this pace, and they made it in 50, the door crashing open, the cold of the water still present in the air of the high space, and Kieran went directly to the wall panel she'd identified from the map, a gray metal box beside the server racks, locked with a 4-digit panel. "Code," he said. "I don't—" She crossed to the panel and looked at it, and her hands went to the keypad, and she entered a sequence without pausing. The sequence she entered from the muscle memory of the program's own methodology, the default override code used across all choir facilities, a code she had learned in the facility's final year when they had started including her in operational logistics as part of the conditioning's later phase. The panel opened. The time system's display showed 9 minutes and 40 seconds. She looked at the wiring for 4 seconds, and then her hands went into the panel, and she found the primary trunk cable and pulled it, and something in the display changed and then stopped. The display went dark. She stood back. The bay was quiet. From above, through the floor, the sounds of Toll's engagement were tapering. Fewer shots, longer intervals, the acoustic signature of a situation resolving. Serafina's hands were shaking. She looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. The shaking arriving now that the function was complete, her body's accounting of everything the last several hours had cost arriving all at once in the only form it could find. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and the shaking didn't stop but became less visible. Kieran looked at the safes along the wall, the archive. "We need Deacons to be wrong," he said. "We need a different contact," she said. "I have one." He looked at her. "Older than Deacons, before the veil reconstruction. Someone who has reason to want this exposed that isn't financial." He paused. "A woman named Corvin. She lost a child to the choir in 2003. She's been building a parallel case for 20 years with whatever fragments she could acquire." He met Serafina's eyes. "She has the standing, she has the will, and she is specifically, deliberately, not on any payroll that can be traced to any organization in the city." Serafina looked at him for a moment. "You had a backup," she said. "I had a backup," he said. Something moved through her face. Not relief, which was too simple, but the specific recalibration of someone adjusting to the information that they were not, in fact, entirely alone in this. "Let's get the safes open," she said. They brought the drives and the hard copies out through the submarine bay's harbor gate as the building above them was secured by Toll's people, and the sounds of the facility finished their settling. Lucien Drax arrived at the complex's perimeter at 2 in the morning with 6 armed men and the expression of someone who had been listening to the situation develop from a distance and had decided, finally, that proximity was required. He found his daughter coming up the harbor access ladder in a torn red dress with a cut on her cheekbone and a waterproof case full of documents she'd pulled from the safes with the pry bar from Kieran's car. He reached down to take her arm and help her up. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She climbed up without taking it. Lucien stood at the top of the ladder as she passed him, and something in him, some structure that had been maintained through decades of will and justification and the specific armor of a man who had decided that survival required a certain quality of self-deception, that structure made a sound, internal, like a load-bearing wall that has passed its limit. "Sarah," he said. She stopped. She didn't turn. "There is nothing," she said quietly, "that you can say right now, and I don't have the energy to hear you try." A pause. "If you want to be useful, have your people secure the building. The director is dead in the lower room. His operatives are incapacitated throughout the corridor system. There is a secondary explosive system that has been disabled but should be verified by someone who knows what they're looking for." She walked toward the car. Lucien stood at the top of the harbor ladder and watched her go, and the thing that had been his face for 30 years of running an empire did something very small and very final, like a door swinging shut on an empty room. He turned to his men. "Do what she said," he told them. It took 6 weeks for Corvin's case to break through. 6 weeks of documents and testimony and the specific machinery of a legal system being asked to process something it had been used to bury before, this time by people who had acquired the leverage and the standing to make the burial impossible. The names on the consortium agreement generated a federal task force. The task force generated arrests. The arrests generated more names. The architecture of it was not clean or swift or satisfying in the way that the narrative of justice tends to present itself. It was slow and contested, and several of the figures involved hired legal representation that delayed proceedings for months and would continue to delay them. But it moved. The first arrest made the news on a Tuesday morning in early winter. Kieran was in a coffee shop 200 miles from Blackwater when he saw it on the television above the counter, and he sat with his cup going cold and watched the footage of federal vehicles outside a building he recognized and felt something he could not immediately categorize. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not the clean triumph he had imagined in 15 years of preparation. Something more exhausted and more honest than that. Something that understood the cost fully, without the relief filtering it. Lucien Drax was arrested on the 4th day of the investigation sweep. He did not fight it. According to Corvin, who called Kieran to deliver the news, he had arrived at the federal building with his lawyer and a complete set of financial records that he had apparently prepared in advance and which documented his own consortium involvement comprehensively. He had provided a full statement. He had named every name he knew. Corvin described it as the most orderly self-dismantling she had ever witnessed. Kieran sat with the phone after the call and thought about Lucian's hand at the top of the harbor ladder and Serafina walking past it, and what it meant that a man capable of what Lucian had done was also capable, in the end, of this. He didn't arrive at a conclusion. He didn't think there was one. The house was on a coastal cliff north of a town that had no particular reason to be famous, and wasn't. A wood-framed house, 2 stories, weathered gray by the salt air to the particular color of driftwood, set back from the cliff edge by a garden that had been left mostly to itself and had made its own decisions about what to grow. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road. The town was 8 minutes by car and had what was required: a market, a hardware store, a diner that opened at 6 and closed at 2 and had no opinions about who came in or what they ordered. Kieran bought it in early December under a name that was legally his, through processes that had been established years before this and that no one who mattered would look twice at. He drove there alone the first time. He stood in the empty house for a long time. In the main room that looked out through large windows at the cliff and the ocean below it, the winter sea going gray and white in the cold, the horizon line very clear against the sky. He had not lived anywhere for 15 years. He had moved between functional spaces, apartments that served operational purposes, hotels, residences that were addresses rather than places. This was something different, and he stood in it and let it be different, and didn't know exactly what to do with the fact that he had arrived somewhere that was, by its nature, a stay. Serafina came 3 weeks later. She came by train, which he had not expected, having assumed she would drive or arrange her own transport in some fashion that maintained control of the approach vector. But she came by train with a single bag that was not large, and she walked from the station to the house along the coast road and arrived in the early afternoon when the winter light was coming in low and gold from the southwest and turning the cliff grass to copper. He heard her on the porch before she knocked. He opened the door before she did. She stood on the porch with the sea wind moving through her hair, loose, the way she wore it when she wasn't managing an appearance. And her face had something in it that he had not seen there before. And it took him a moment to identify it because it was unfamiliar. Not because he didn't know it, but because it was the specific quality of a face that has, for the first time in a long time, arrived somewhere without an exit strategy already planned. "You found it," he said. "You sent me the address," she said. "I know. I meant you found it. The house." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." She came in. She did what she always did in a new space. The brief systematic check, the windows, the exits, the geography. But this time it was faster and briefer than it had been in the penthouse. And when she finished it, she stood in the main room looking out at the ocean and the specific held tension that had lived in her shoulders since the first time he'd seen her in the cathedral was not gone, because it didn't go, not entirely, not in 6 weeks or 60 or possibly ever, but different. lower. Something that had been held at the ceiling brought down by some incremental process he hadn't witnessed, to a height the body could maintain without all of its resources. They ate dinner that first evening at the table by the window, and the conversation was not about any of it. Not Maier, not the dock, not the safes or the legal proceedings, or Lucien's statement, or any of the machinery that was grinding away 200 miles south. They talked about the town, which she had observed on her walk from the station. They talked about the house, which needed work on the roof on the north side and had an inexplicably well-equipped workshop in the back garden. They talked about the diner, which Kieran had visited twice and which had a particular kind of pie that he had found unaccountably important to mention. She listened to him talk about the pie with an expression that was almost something. After dinner, she stood at the window with her tea going cold in her hands and looked at the dark sea, the lights of a distant tanker moving slow across the black horizon. "I still don't sleep well," she said. "I want you to know that. It's not going to fix overnight." "I know. The nightmares are less frequent, but they're not gone." She looked at the window glass. "Some of what's in me, the reflex structures, the threat mapping, the languages, that doesn't dissolve. It won't. It's in the tissue." She paused. "I'm not going to become someone who didn't go through what I went through." "I'm not asking you to," he said. She was quiet. "What are you asking?" she said. He thought about it. He thought about it honestly. The way he had been trying to think about things since the corridor after the gala, since the submarine bay, since the moment it became clear that everything he had spent 15 years constructing had been built on a foundation that belonged to someone else, and that the only thing he actually owned was the present tense. "Nothing yet," he said. "I think we've both spent enough time living under what other people asked of us." She turned from the window and looked at him. He looked back. The house settled around them in the wind, the small sounds of a structure that was alive in the way old wood-framed buildings near the sea were alive, adjusting and creaking and present. The table between them with the dinner things still on it, the light low and warm from the lamp in the corner, the sound of the ocean below the cliff, constant and indifferent, and somehow, in its indifference, a relief. "Okay," she said. She set her teacup on the table and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the night. He stayed where he was. After a while, she said without looking at him, "The dog, from before." She paused. "I remembered the color. Today, on the train, I remembered it. Gray. His name was Gray." She said it carefully, the way you say something you've been waiting a long time to retrieve. "I don't know why that came back today." He didn't answer immediately. "Maybe," he said finally, "because you weren't using the space for something else." She was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," she said. Outside, the winter sea continued its conversation with the cliff below. The sound of it moving through the house's walls, the way the harbor had moved through the penthouse glass. But different here. Not the harbor of a city running its dark machinery. The open ocean. The long, unenclosed water. The sound of something that had no walls and no agenda, and no memory of any of the things that had happened in the rooms of human lives along its edge. Months would pass. The legal proceedings would run their slow course. Names would continue to surface. Some would disappear into the machinery of delayed justice, and some would not. Corvin would call, periodically, with updates delivered in her precise and unsentimental manner, and Kieran would listen and answer questions and provide clarifications, and then end the call and stand for a moment wherever he was and return to whatever he'd been doing. Serafina would have nights that were not recoverable until morning. She would wake sometimes still running in some direction that no longer existed in the waking world, and it would take minutes to locate herself in the gray house on the cliff, and the present tense, and the specific physical evidence of where she was and who was in the next room. The minutes would get shorter over time, not uniform. Some nights were worse than the nights before them, because recovery was not a straight line, and anyone who told you otherwise had never done it seriously. But the mornings were hers. That was new. That was the thing that was new, and it accumulated. One evening in early spring, she was on the porch when he came out, the light going long and amber across the cliff grass, and the sea below going from gray to a color that didn't have a common name. Something between blue and green and the particular depth of water that had been the same water since before people had been standing on cliffs watching it. She was barefoot on the wooden boards. He came to stand beside her. The wind off the water came in with the smell of salt and cold and something green from further down the coast, and she turned her face into it slightly, the way a person turns their face toward warmth, an old instinct, a body remembering that some things that come toward you are not threats. "You're quiet," he said. She looked at the horizon for a moment. "For years," she said, "I thought surviving was the same thing as living." The sea moved below them. The light moved across it. He didn't say anything for a moment. He put his jacket around her shoulders, the weight of it settling against her, and she didn't move away from it. "And now?" he said. She was quiet for a moment longer. The pause of someone arriving at a sentence they have not said before. A sentence that is being assembled from parts that are real rather than performed, tested against the actual interior state before release. The wave that came against the cliff below them was not dramatic. It came the way waves come when no one has written them a role, so patient, continuous, doing the simple work of water meeting stone. Serafina looked at the horizon. For the first time in the entire length of this story, something happened in her face that was not managed, not deployed, not the product of any training or any survival strategy or any of the long work of becoming presentable. It was small. It was real. And it stayed. "Now," she said, "I finally know the difference." The wind moved through her hair. The sea held its color for another few minutes before the light changed, the way the sea does, indifferent to endings, present for all of them, continuing after. The cliff was quiet. The house behind them was lit.